What if the secret to aging gracefully lies in 3 foods you never thought about? Jake could hardly believe his eyes. It was late, around midnight, when his phone buzzed, startling him awake. Blinking in the darkness of his bedroom, he reached for the device on the nightstand. His old eyes took a moment to adjust, but when they did, a headline caught his attention. Elon Musk reveals the 3 foods seniors need for muscle health. He rubbed his face, groaning as he sat up in bed. Elon Musk? The man was a genius, no doubt about it. He had sent rockets to space, built the world's most advanced electric cars, and even got involved in things like brain-computer interfaces. But muscle health for seniors? That was new. Jake felt a wave of cynicism wash over him. At 68 years old, his life had followed a predictable course. He'd worked hard, raised 2 wonderful kids, and retired to a quiet life in the suburbs. But lately, the signs of aging were hard to ignore. His joints ached, his muscles felt weaker, and his once vibrant energy was starting to drain away. Simple tasks, like climbing stairs or picking up a grocery bag, felt like little victories. For years, Jake had tried everything. He'd walked daily, stretched religiously, and taken all sorts of vitamins. Yet nothing seemed to reverse the inevitable, his body was betraying him. Jake had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but even he couldn't deny it anymore. He was getting older, and that meant his strength wasn't what it used to be. And the idea that a tech billionaire like Musk might have the answers. It was almost laughable. But then again, what if it was true? Sighing, Jake leaned back against his pillows and clicked on the article. As the page loaded, his curiosity piqued. The headline blared at him again, 3 foods seniors need for muscle health. The article's opening paragraph was clear and direct. In a recent interview, Elon Musk shared his thoughts on aging, muscle loss, and the foods that can help seniors maintain strength. These 3 foods, according to Musk, are vital for muscle health and longevity. Jake's mind raced. Could food really make that much of a difference? The article went on to explain that muscle loss in seniors wasn't just about lifting weights or running marathons, it was about maintaining the quality of muscle mass for better mobility, independence, and overall health. Musk, with his usual charisma, had emphasized that strength didn't have to fade with age. And then the foods. The article teased the list, but Jake couldn't wait any longer. He scrolled down. Salmon. Spinach. Almonds. That was it. 3 simple foods that Musk swore could turn back the clock. Jake stared at the screen. Salmon. Spinach. Almonds. Those weren't exactly revolutionary choices. They weren't the kind of miracle foods people typically associated with miracle diets. But something about the way Musk had presented it, the certainty in his words, struck a chord with Jake. He had always heard about the importance of a balanced diet, but these foods seemed so simple. Maybe too simple. Then his phone buzzed again. It was a message from his daughter, Emily. "Dad, how are you doing? Have you heard about this Musk thing? I think we should try it. I can help you get those foods if you want." Jake chuckled softly. Emily had always been the proactive one in the family. She was the type who read health articles obsessively and could recite the benefits of every nutrient known to man. She was also the one who insisted he see a doctor about his muscle weakness in the first place. Jake always humored her, but he knew deep down, she worried too much. "I don't know, Jake typed back, Elon Musk's diet plan. Doesn't sound like something I should be following." He paused for a moment before sending it. He felt a bit ridiculous. After all, it wasn't as if he had all the answers himself. And if there was a chance Musk's advice could help him feel better, then what harm could there be in trying? Jake's fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then, with a sigh, he added, "I'll give it a shot." "You win, as usual." He hit send, putting the phone down. The night was still quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. But Jake's mind was racing now. Could he really change his health with just a few simple foods? And more importantly, could he regain some of the strength he'd lost over the years? As he lay back down, a thought crossed his mind: maybe this was the spark he needed. Maybe, just maybe, Musk had figured something out. The next morning, Jake went to the grocery store. It wasn't a long trip, but it was the first time in a while he'd gone out specifically to improve his health. He picked up a fresh fillet of salmon, a bag of spinach, and a jar of almonds. As he put the items into his cart, a small part of him felt ridiculous. Was this really going to work? He tried to push the doubt aside, telling himself that he wasn't a fool for following advice from an entrepreneur. After all, Musk was a visionary, and perhaps he was onto something. Besides, what did Jake have to lose? That evening, Jake prepared his first meal following Musk's prescription. He grilled the salmon and steamed the spinach, sprinkling a few almonds on top for crunch. It was a simple meal, almost too simple. But as he took his first bite, something inside him stirred. It wasn't just the taste, it was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was taking control of his health again. Jake smiled to himself. This could be the beginning of something. As he finished his dinner, he sent another text to Emily. "All right, I've got my salmon, spinach, and almonds. Here's hoping Musk's right." A few moments later, Emily replied with an enthusiastic, "You've got this, Dad. Let me know how it goes." Jake set his phone down, took another bite of his meal, and sighed. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. He wasn't sure if the food would work, or if it was just some clever marketing scheme. But for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a flicker of hope. He had been feeling weak for so long. Maybe this was the change he needed. Maybe it wasn't too late to feel strong again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake was no stranger to hard work. Growing up in a small town just outside of Cleveland, Ohio, he had always been the kind of person who believed that success came from grit, determination, and a willingness to roll up your sleeves. His father, a mechanic who had worked at the local auto shop for as long as Jake could remember, had instilled that mindset in him from an early age. Jake's childhood had been far from glamorous, but it was filled with love and lessons in perseverance. He learned to work on cars before he even learned to drive. His father had taught him how to rebuild an engine when he was just 12, and by the time he was a teenager, he could fix almost anything. "Don't let anything beat you," his dad used to say. "You can always fix it, as long as you try." Jake had taken those words to heart, but as life went on, he began to realize something important: fixing things wasn't always as simple as it seemed. His father had passed away 5 years ago, leaving a gaping hole in his life. But more than that, Jake realized his own body was starting to break down, just like the cars he used to fix. At 68, Jake's body was showing signs of wear and tear. The aches and pains that had once been fleeting annoyances had become constant companions. His hands, which had once deftly worked on engines, now stiffened with arthritis. His knees, which had carried him through thousands of miles of walking, now creaked and groaned with every step. But what bothered Jake the most was the feeling of weakness that had started creeping in. It wasn't the occasional soreness after a long day, no, this was different. He couldn't do the things he used to enjoy. Simple tasks like lifting a bag of groceries or carrying a heavy box seemed like monumental feats. And worse, it felt like something was slipping away that he couldn't fix. This was the part of aging that no one warned him about. It wasn't just the wrinkles or the graying hair, it was the loss of strength, the feeling of helplessness, the uncertainty about how much longer his body would be able to keep up. Jake's wife, Maggie, had noticed it too. She'd been with him for 40 years, and though they'd weathered their share of ups and downs, this was something new. Maggie was a rock, always practical and supportive, but lately, she'd been more concerned. Jake knew she hated seeing him struggle, and that made him feel even worse. Maggie would often suggest that they go on walks together, but Jake always came up with excuses. He'd tell her he was tired or that his knees were bothering him too much. The truth was, he was embarrassed. He didn't want to admit how much he had changed, how weak he had become. Their children, Emily and David, both lived out of state now, but they called regularly. Emily, in particular, was the one who worried most about him. She had inherited her mother's caring nature, but she also had a drive and ambition that often bordered on obsession. If Emily was concerned about something, she wouldn't rest until she figured it out. And these days, her main concern was Jake's health. "Dad, you need to start seeing a doctor about your muscle loss," she would say whenever they spoke. Jake hated hearing it, but he couldn't ignore the truth. His body was changing in ways he couldn't control. And worse, it seemed like he had no control over how to fix it. So, he did what he always did, he ignored it. He focused on his work, tinkered with the old tools in his garage, and pretended things were fine. After all, he'd always been able to fix things. Why should his own body be any different? But it was getting harder to ignore. The strain on his muscles, the difficulty with even basic tasks, was becoming impossible to overlook. One morning, after a particularly bad night of tossing and turning, Jake woke up to a message from Emily. She had sent him a link to an article about muscle health for seniors, something about how diet could improve strength and mobility. Jake groaned as he opened the link, unsure of what to expect. But the headline immediately caught his attention: Elon Musk reveals the 3 foods seniors need for muscle health. It was a random thing for Emily to send, but something about the headline intrigued him. He had been hearing more and more about Musk lately, not just for his ventures in space exploration or electric cars, but for his thoughts on health, technology, and the future of humanity. Maybe there was something to this. Maybe there was a way to fix himself, his muscles, his health, his life. But as Jake read further, a sense of doubt crept in. It all seemed too simple. 3 foods. Could it really be that easy? He clicked on the article and began reading. The foods Musk recommended, salmon, spinach, and almonds, sounded, well, like a normal diet. But it was the idea behind them that caught Jake's attention. Musk claimed that, unlike common wisdom about protein or supplements, these foods work to help seniors maintain muscle mass and strength, specifically designed for older bodies. Jake had never thought about food in this way. He had always just eaten what he liked, never really paying attention to the specific benefits of each food. But maybe he was wrong to ignore it. As he sat there, Jake began to feel a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe he could do something to change the way he felt, after all. That evening, as Jake sat down for dinner, he thought about his father again. He had always admired how his dad had never given up, no matter what the challenge. Even when the auto shop had started to lose business, his dad had found a way to make ends meet. He had never been one to accept weakness or failure. Jake wanted to be like that. He wanted to fight against the aging process and not let it take away his strength. And maybe, just maybe, these 3 foods were the answer. As he ate a simple meal that included salmon, spinach, and almonds, Jake couldn't help but think of how little effort it took. But the question lingered: could this really work? Could these simple foods help him get stronger again? He finished his meal, feeling a bit more optimistic. But deep down, Jake knew that the real challenge lay ahead, trusting in something new, something simple, and putting his faith in a diet from an unlikely source, Elon Musk. The next few days after Jake's first attempt at the Musk diet were strange. On one hand, he felt more hopeful than he had in a long time. The meals were easy to prepare, and honestly, they didn't taste half bad. The salmon was rich and flaky, the spinach surprisingly satisfying, and the almonds added just the right amount of crunch. Nothing too crazy, but Jake felt a small sense of accomplishment every time he sat down to eat. He'd always been a man who preferred simple meals, and for once, it seemed like his choice was something that might actually help him. But on the other hand, there was a nagging voice in his head: one that grew louder with each passing day. "This is stupid, Jake. You're fooling yourself. This isn't going to make a difference." At first, he tried to ignore it. After all, the whole point of this new diet was to give it time. It wasn't like you could expect to see results overnight. Still, every time he felt a twinge in his knees or a dull ache in his back, he couldn't help but wonder if it was all just a waste of time. Maggie had noticed it, too. She could see Jake trying to stay positive, but she also saw how distracted he was. The skepticism was all over his face. He'd push the food around on his plate sometimes, or get lost in thought when they were eating together. She didn't say anything at first, but it was clear that he wasn't fully invested. One afternoon, as Jake was lounging in his favorite armchair, reading a book about classic car restorations, Maggie walked into the living room. She was holding a glass of water in one hand, a concerned expression on her face. "Jake," she said gently, sitting down across from him. "You've been doing this diet for over a week now. How are you feeling?" Jake glanced up from his book, his brow furrowing. "I'm fine. Just a little sore, I guess. But nothing too bad." Maggie wasn't convinced. "It's more than just the soreness, isn't it? You've been acting off. You're not really giving this a fair shot." He sighed, putting his book down and rubbing his eyes. "I don't know, Maggie. I mean, it's just 3 foods. Salmon, spinach, almonds. I don't know how that's supposed to change everything. My body's been breaking down for years now. What's the point?" She raised an eyebrow, her voice soft but firm. "The point is, you're trying. And that's more than you've done in a long time. I get it, you're skeptical. But you haven't given it enough time. Besides, don't you think your body deserves the chance to fight back?" Jake stared at her, caught off guard by the intensity in her words. For years, Maggie had been his sounding board, the calm and steady voice when he felt like the world was spinning out of control. But this was different. She wasn't just reassuring him, she was challenging him. "I know you're right," Jake muttered. "But sometimes I wonder if this whole thing is just a way of pretending I can turn back time. You know, I've tried everything, exercise, supplements, even stretching. And none of it worked. What makes this any different?" Maggie didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "Jake, when I met you, you were a fighter. Every day was about moving forward. You never gave up on anything. So, I'm asking you to do what you've always done, don't give up on this." Her words stung, more than he expected. He'd never thought about it that way before. He had always been a man who faced every challenge head-on. And now, here he was, doubting himself, doubting the possibility of change. "All right," Jake said, finally giving in. "I'll keep at it. For a little longer." Over the next few days, Jake followed the diet with more consistency, though his doubts lingered. There were moments when the initial sense of hope began to fade, and the weight of his physical decline seemed to return in full force. Every time he bent down to pick up something off the floor and felt the stiffness in his lower back, or every time he had to pause to catch his breath after walking a few steps, his frustration grew. He was starting to think that maybe Maggie was right. He hadn't given it a fair shot yet. But then there were those moments when he wanted to quit, when he felt like he was just spinning his wheels. What if nothing changed? What if he couldn't reverse the inevitable? It was on one of those days that Emily called. "Dad, how's it going?" Her voice came through the phone, a mix of concern and curiosity. Jake hesitated, not sure if he wanted to share his frustrations. He didn't want to disappoint her. "It's going, okay, I guess. I've been eating the salmon, spinach, and almonds like you said. But I don't know, Em. I haven't noticed much difference." Emily didn't seem discouraged. "Dad, you've only been doing it for a little over a week. It takes time. Just remember, it's about consistency. And don't forget about the other things: hydration, sleep, managing stress. It all matters. Jake rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of it all. Yeah, I know. But sometimes it just feels like no matter what I do, I'm losing the battle. You know. The body doesn't work the way it used to. I feel like I'm just falling apart. Dad, listen, Emily said, her tone soft but firm. You've been through a lot. But you've got this. One step at a time. I believe in you. Her words were exactly what he needed to hear, and for the first time in days, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he had been too quick to judge. Maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Later that evening, Jake sat down at the kitchen table for dinner. He took a bite of the salmon, the familiar taste of the meal grounding him in the moment. His muscles still felt tight, his joints still stiff, but something inside him was starting to change. Maybe it wasn't about seeing immediate results. Maybe it was about trusting in the process, even when it felt uncertain. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the real key to success: resilience, and a belief that even small changes could eventually lead to something bigger. As Jake finished his meal, he smiled to himself. He had no idea if this would work, but he was determined to see it through. The morning after Jake's conversation with Emily, something inside him shifted. He woke up earlier than usual, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the living room. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like staying in bed all day. He wasn't quite sure what had triggered the change. Maybe it was Emily's words, or maybe it was Maggie's quiet but persistent encouragement, but something inside him told him it was time to make a real effort. After his morning coffee, Jake went into his garage. The familiar scent of oil, grease, and old leather filled the air as he grabbed his tools. His once beloved hobby of fixing cars had long since taken a back seat to the more pressing concerns of his health, but today, something felt different. He looked at the half-finished car restoration project in the corner of the garage. A 1967 Ford Mustang, the car his father had always dreamed of fixing up before he got too old. The car had become a symbol of everything Jake had lost, a dream he could no longer afford to chase. But today, as he ran his fingers over the cold steel frame, Jake made a decision. He would start small, just like with the diet. He wasn't going to overhaul everything all at once. Just one step at a time. He wiped the sweat off his brow and grabbed a wrench. The old car wasn't going to fix itself, and neither was he. Over the next few days, Jake found himself becoming more immersed in the process. Each morning, he would go out to the garage to work on the Mustang, putting in a little time and effort. His knees still ached, his hands still stiffened from years of use, but each time he tightened a bolt or cleaned a piece of the engine, it felt like a small victory. He started feeling a slight difference in his muscles, too. The aching didn't go away, but it was different somehow. Less intense. It was as if the simple act of working on the car, of moving his body in a focused way, was helping him rebuild something he thought was long gone. His hands, though still rough and weathered, seemed to have more dexterity than before. His back, although stiff, felt stronger when he stood up straight. The diet was also starting to show some results. He'd been eating the salmon, spinach, and almonds religiously, and while the physical changes were still subtle, Jake could feel his energy levels rising. His sleep had improved, too. He wasn't waking up as often in the middle of the night with aches and pains. And he found that he had more energy during the day, energy he used to work on his projects, or even just to take a short walk down the block. But even with all the improvements, doubt was still a constant companion. Jake could feel it lurking, especially during the harder days. The days when his muscles felt heavier than usual, when his knees ached after just a few minutes of walking, or when he had trouble lifting something as simple as a carton of milk. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he said one afternoon as he sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. Maggie, who was putting away dishes in the kitchen, turned around and walked over to him. You don't have to do it all at once, Jake. Take it one day at a time. I get that, Maggie, he said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. But sometimes, it just feels like I'm not getting anywhere. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never going to be enough. Maggie sat down across from him, taking his hand in hers. I know it's hard. I know it feels like nothing's changing. But remember, you've been doing this for just a little while. It takes time. And you're making progress, even if you can't see it right now. Jake sighed, knowing she was right. But in that moment, he couldn't help but feel like he was at a crossroads. The effort he was putting in felt like a mountain he was slowly climbing, but the summit always seemed too far out of reach. It was frustrating. That evening, as Jake walked down the street to the park, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. The air was cool and crisp, the street lamps casting long shadows on the sidewalk. His mind wandered back to the article Emily had sent him, about the foods Musk claimed could improve muscle health. Jake had always prided himself on being a do-it-yourself kind of guy, the kind of man who didn't wait for solutions to come to him, he went out and made them happen. So why did it feel so strange to trust something as simple as a diet? Was this really the answer? Could these 3 foods really make the difference in the long run? As he walked, Jake noticed an elderly couple on a bench, laughing together as they fed pigeons. The man had to use a cane, and the woman had a bit of a limp, but there they were, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. They didn't seem to be bothered by their physical limitations. In fact, they seemed happy. Jake paused and watched them for a few moments, a thought forming in his mind. What if it wasn't about feeling like he was 25 again? What if it was just about finding peace with where he was now, and accepting that some things would change, but that didn't mean life had to stop? Maybe he wasn't going to run marathons again, or be able to lift heavy engines with ease. But maybe he could still find strength in the little things. Maybe that was enough. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. Dad, just wanted to check in. How are you feeling? Any improvements? Jake smiled at the message, grateful for the connection. He typed back, it's slow, but I'm making progress. I think I'm starting to get it. It's not about being perfect. It's just about doing what I can. He hit send and tucked the phone back into his pocket. As he continued walking, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, Jake felt a bit lighter. The journey was still far from over, but he was starting to see that maybe it wasn't the destination that mattered most, it was the journey itself. And even on the tough days, those small steps forward counted. Later that night, as Jake sat down to dinner with Maggie, he felt something different. He was still sore, still tired, but there was a quiet confidence that wasn't there before. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was taking control again, not of his past, but of his present. And that, he realized, was the most important step of all. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. Jake had slowly started adjusting to his new routine, but there were still moments of doubt, moments where the weight of his past struggles seemed to creep in and threaten to pull him under. The pain in his body hadn't disappeared completely, but it had lessened. The constant aches in his joints, the stiffness in his lower back, and the fatigue that used to hang over him like a heavy cloud were all a little more bearable. Yet, deep down, Jake knew that the real challenge wasn't his physical condition, it was the battle in his mind. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. Something within him was shifting, too. Every time he'd sit down for a meal and eat his salmon, spinach, and almonds, he'd feel a small surge of pride. He was doing something for himself, something he hadn't done in years, he was taking control. The more he followed the diet, the more he began to notice subtle changes. He had more energy during the day. He wasn't dragging himself through his usual routine anymore. He could walk a little longer, climb the stairs without pausing to catch his breath, and even spend more time in the garage, working on his projects. But it wasn't just the physical changes. There was a shift in his mindset, too. The frustration and resentment he'd been carrying for years were starting to fade, replaced by a quiet determination that felt foreign yet welcome. One evening, as Jake prepared another simple meal, he found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the salmon in front of him. The smell of the fish, the crispness of the spinach, the smoothness of the almonds, it had all become so familiar. He almost didn't have to think about it anymore. It was as though the ritual itself had become a small anchor, a way to ground him amidst the chaos of his thoughts. But then, as he sliced into the salmon, a flash of memory hit him hard. He remembered his father, how they used to work on cars together, side by side in this very garage. His father had always been strong, a constant source of guidance and wisdom, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. Jake hadn't realized it before, but now, the idea of being strong, both physically and emotionally, felt like a connection to his father that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Tears welled up in his eyes as the weight of the memory settled on him. His father had passed away years ago, but in that moment, Jake could feel his presence. It was as if his father were right there, standing beside him, offering encouragement without a single word. "You can do this, son. Just like you always have." It was a fleeting thought, but it was enough to give Jake a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe it wasn't just about getting his muscles back. Maybe it was about honoring the man his father had been, strong, resilient, and determined to keep moving forward, no matter what life threw his way. That night, Jake sat on the porch with Maggie, sipping on a glass of iced tea. The evening air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the background. They didn't speak for a while. Just sat together in a comfortable silence, each wrapped in their own thoughts. Finally, Maggie broke the quiet. "I've been thinking about something," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You've been so focused on your body, on getting stronger physically, but I think something even more important has been happening. You're healing inside, Jake. I can see it." Jake looked at her, surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Maggie continued, "I can see it in your eyes. The way you're carrying yourself. You're starting to believe in yourself again. You're starting to let go of the guilt, the anger, the frustration. And that's just as important as getting your body back in shape." Jake's chest tightened as Maggie's words hit home. It was true. For years, he'd been carrying a weight he couldn't shake off, the weight of his regrets, the guilt of not being the man he wanted to be, and the anger at his body for failing him. But now, as he sat there with Maggie, something inside him was letting go. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the burden was lifting. And in its place was something he hadn't expected, peace. "I never realized how much I was holding on to," Jake murmured, more to himself than to Maggie. "You've been holding on to a lot," she said gently, her eyes meeting his. "But you're letting go, piece by piece. And that's huge." Jake nodded slowly, his throat tightening. It wasn't just the diet or the physical progress he was making, it was about releasing the emotional weight he had been carrying for so long. It was about finding balance between his past and his present, and finally accepting that both were part of him. That was the real transformation. The next morning, Jake woke up earlier than usual. He felt an unusual energy coursing through his body, a feeling he hadn't had in years. His muscles were still stiff, but there was an underlying strength to them, something more solid and dependable. He stretched, moving with a fluidity he hadn't noticed in a long time. His morning routine had become a ritual. He went to the garage and spent a few hours on the Mustang, tightening bolts, cleaning parts, and even doing some minor welding. Each movement felt more confident, more purposeful. He wasn't just fixing a car, he was fixing himself. Later that afternoon, as Jake went for a walk through the neighborhood, he noticed something that struck him: he wasn't in a rush. In the past, he would have tried to speed through the walk, always pushing himself to go further, faster. But today, he walked at a leisurely pace, enjoying the fresh air, taking in the sights, and appreciating the small things he used to overlook. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It wasn't just about the diet or the exercise. It was about the little changes, the way he saw the world, the way he saw himself. He was stronger, yes, but more importantly, he was learning to be kind to himself, to give himself the grace he deserved. Jake smiled as he walked. There was still a long road ahead of him, and he knew there would be tough days. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what was to come. He wasn't afraid of the changes, because he had learned that the journey itself, the process of becoming stronger, inside and out, was just as important as the destination. And with that realization, Jake knew one thing for sure: he was finally on the right path. Jake had never been a fan of the word routine. In his younger years, he prided himself on his ability to adapt, on his freedom to move through life without being tied down by anything too predictable. But now, after weeks of following his new eating habits, working on the Mustang, and taking those daily walks, Jake realized something: routine wasn't so bad after all. In fact, it was becoming his anchor. Every morning, he followed the same basic schedule. A small breakfast of salmon and spinach, a quiet hour spent in the garage, a walk around the block, then another round of tinkering with the car or handling small chores around the house. He'd found that keeping busy, even if it was with seemingly insignificant tasks, gave him a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the body anymore, it was about the structure, the consistency that kept his mind focused and grounded. He was slowly learning that, in order to heal, he needed to bring some predictability into his life. It was a strange feeling, but it worked. One afternoon, as Jake sat on the porch, sipping his iced tea, he received a call from Emily. "Hey, Dad," she greeted him enthusiastically. "How's everything going?" Jake leaned back in his chair, looking out at the quiet street. He'd always had a hard time talking about his emotions, but somehow, with Emily, it felt different. She was his daughter, after all. She'd seen the best and worst of him, and through it all, she still loved him. It made sharing things easier. "It's going better than I thought, actually," Jake admitted, a smile creeping onto his face. "I've been sticking to the routine. Working on the Mustang, walking more, eating better." "That's amazing." Emily's voice was full of pride. "I can hear it in your voice. You sound better." Jake chuckled, though it was a little embarrassed. "Yeah, well, it's not perfect. I still get sore sometimes, and some days feel harder than others. But I'm sticking with it. Little by little." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Emily spoke again, her tone was quieter, more serious. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what you're doing. And, I wanted to ask you something." Jake felt a slight knot in his stomach. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Emily hesitated before speaking. "I've been talking to some people at work about muscle health, nutrition, and recovery. They all keep mentioning how important it is to really listen to your body during this time. Like, it's not just about sticking to the diet and the exercise. It's about understanding when to push and when to rest. It's about finding that balance, you know." Jake furrowed his brow, his mind processing the words. It wasn't a concept he'd thought much about, but it made sense. He'd been pushing himself hard, trying to keep up with the schedule he'd set. Maybe, just maybe, he needed to give himself permission to slow down every once in a while. "I hear you," Jake said thoughtfully. "It's hard for me to rest. I've spent so much time just trying to keep moving forward, to not fall behind. But maybe you're right. Maybe I do need to listen to my body more." Emily's voice softened. "I know it's hard, Dad. But remember, it's okay to take breaks. You've been through a lot, and you're doing great. Just don't be afraid to take a step back when you need to. Progress doesn't always mean constant motion. Sometimes, it's about standing still long enough to catch your breath." Jake sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on her words. It was one of those rare moments where he realized something significant, something he had never truly grasped before. Later that evening, after hanging up with Emily, Jake decided to go for his usual walk. But this time, something felt different. He didn't rush through it. He allowed himself to walk slower, to take in the sights and sounds around him. The sound of the breeze in the trees, the chirping of the birds, and the quiet hum of the world in motion, it all seemed more vivid tonight. He wasn't just moving through the motions. He was present. As he strolled down the familiar street, he found himself thinking more about what Emily had said. For years, he'd been taught that success meant pushing through every obstacle, never slowing down, always trying to do more. It had worked for him in the past, at least to some extent. But now, with his health on the line, it was clear that doing more wasn't always the answer. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to stop. Knowing when to rest. The next morning, Jake woke up with a sense of calm that had eluded him for weeks. His body still felt sore, but it didn't feel like it was the end of the world. He stretched gently, taking his time to loosen his muscles, and then, instead of heading straight to the garage or walking a mile around the block, he sat down in the living room with his cup of coffee and just rested. He didn't feel guilty about it. For the first time, he wasn't in a race against time. He understood now that healing wasn't about how quickly he could get back to where he was, it was about how he took care of himself in the process. When Maggie came into the room later, she paused when she saw Jake sitting on the couch, not moving toward his usual routine. "You're resting," she said with a small smile. "I'm surprised." Jake looked up at her, a slow smile forming on his face. "I think I'm starting to get it." Maggie raised an eyebrow, sitting down next to him. "Get what?" "Getting it right," he said. "I've been so focused on pushing through that I forgot about balance. I can't just keep going and going without giving myself a break. I've learned that it's okay to rest, to slow down, and to really listen to my body." Maggie nodded, her expression softening. "It's a big realization, Jake. And you're doing great. I can see the changes, not just in your body but in your attitude." Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was still long, but now he knew that the key wasn't in never stopping. The key was in knowing when to push forward and when to rest. As Jake sat back and relaxed into the couch, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was truly taking care of himself. Not just his body, but his mind and his soul. And that was the most important part of the journey. The turning point wasn't just about muscle health or diets or even working on the Mustang. It was about learning to be kind to himself. To accept his imperfections. To rest when he needed to. And to move forward when he was ready. He knew there would be setbacks, but now, he had the tools to face them. He had learned that sometimes, slowing down was the best way to move forward. The week had been an emotional roller coaster for Jake. He had spent the past few days adjusting to his newfound perspective on life and health, taking time to reflect on his journey. It wasn't always easy to slow down, but there was something freeing about it. Something liberating. Every morning, he would wake up early, stretch his stiff muscles, and take a moment to breathe deeply before launching into his routine. The clarity he'd gained from his conversation with Emily stayed with him, and it was like he could feel a weight lifting off his shoulders with each passing day. But still, there were moments of doubt. Those old habits crept in, the desire to rush through everything, to get back to normal as quickly as possible. Jake could feel his body rebelling against it sometimes. There were still days when he'd wake up and feel a deep ache in his back, a reminder that he wasn't as strong as he used to be, that the path to recovery was going to take time. He wasn't used to this kind of slow progress. He was used to pushing himself to the limit, to achieving things quickly and efficiently. But he had learned, slowly and painfully, that rushing through the healing process only led to setbacks. That afternoon, Jake found himself in the garage again, working on the Mustang. The familiar smell of oil and rust mixed with the fresh air coming in through the open door. He loved being here, surrounded by the cars and tools that had been a constant in his life. But today, he wasn't so much focused on the work as he was on something else. He stood up from the car and wiped his hands on a rag. He had an idea, one that had been quietly bubbling in the back of his mind for a while. It was time to push himself a little further. Not in the way he'd done before, by demanding more from his body, but by demanding more from his commitment to himself. He needed to take the next step in his healing, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Jake walked over to the corner of the garage where his old weight set sat. It had been collecting dust for months now, a reminder of the gym routine he used to follow religiously. The old bench press, the dumbbells, all of it had been a part of his life back when he was in peak condition. But he hadn't touched them in a long time. Not since he'd realized that his obsession with his body's appearance had overshadowed the deeper work he needed to do. Today, however, felt different. He wasn't going to use the weights to push his muscles to exhaustion. He wasn't looking to get back to his old self. He was going to do this differently. He was going to listen to his body, take it slow, and remember the balance he had been learning to embrace. An hour later, Jake was lying on the bench, the dumbbells resting in his hands. He wasn't lifting heavy weights, he started with a modest amount, just enough to challenge his muscles without straining them. He focused on the movement, feeling each muscle group engage as he slowly pressed the weights up and down. It was more about the sensation of control than about the amount of weight. Each press was a small victory. He wasn't competing with anyone, not even with his former self. He was just present. Each breath he took was measured and calm, each movement deliberate. It felt good, not in the way it used to feel when he'd pushed through pain, but in the way it felt to move with intention and mindfulness. His body responded to the challenge, but there was no desperation to get through it. There was only the here and now. After a few sets, Jake put the dumbbells down and sat up, feeling the sweat trickle down his forehead. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline he had once gotten after a heavy workout, but there was something else, something quieter. A feeling of accomplishment, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't about the number of reps. It wasn't about the amount of weight he could lift. It was about showing up. It was about honoring his body and his mind. It was about learning to take things one step at a time, not forcing himself to rush to the finish line. The next morning, Jake took another walk around the block. His muscles were sore, but it wasn't the painful kind of soreness he'd experienced in the past. It was the good kind, the kind that came with growth, with progress. As he walked, he thought about what had changed. He thought about his journey, the moments of clarity he had experienced, and how much he had learned along the way. And it hit him then, the breakthrough he hadn't quite realized until now. It wasn't just about strength. It wasn't just about muscle health or eating the right foods. It was about self-awareness. It was about accepting the fact that healing wasn't linear. Some days would be harder than others. But that was okay. What mattered was that he was still moving forward, even if it was at a slower pace than he was used to. That afternoon, Jake sat down with Maggie again. She was always there for him, always ready with a word of encouragement or a moment of support. He had learned to value those moments more than he ever thought possible. "Maggie," he began, his voice a little hesitant but full of sincerity, "I think I'm starting to understand it all now. I used to think healing was about just powering through it. That I needed to be back at 100% as fast as possible. But now, I realize it's about being kind to myself. It's about doing the work, but not forcing it. Not rushing it." Maggie looked up from the book she was reading and smiled at him. "I'm proud of you, Jake. You're getting it. I can see it in how you carry yourself. You've come a long way." Jake felt a surge of gratitude. There was no grand celebration, no huge dramatic moment. It was just a quiet understanding between the two of them, a recognition of how far he had come, not just physically but emotionally as well. It wasn't about where he was going, it was about who he was becoming. As the days passed, Jake continued to take things one step at a time. He still had moments of doubt, still had days where his body ached more than he wanted it to. But each day was an opportunity to learn, to grow, to accept where he was and move forward from there. He wasn't looking for perfection anymore. He was looking for progress, and that was enough. That evening, as Jake sat on the porch once again, watching the sunset with Maggie, he realized that this moment, this quiet, simple moment, was the one he had been waiting for. It wasn't a grand revelation, and it wasn't an end to the journey. It was just the beginning. The beginning of understanding that strength, real strength, came from more than just the muscles in his body. It came from the way he treated himself, the way he honored his limits, and the way he embraced every part of his journey, no matter how slow or difficult it seemed. And for the first time in a long time, Jake was at peace with that. Jake woke up with a familiar soreness in his shoulders. The kind that made him pause for a moment, wondering whether he should get up or stay in bed. But he didn't let himself linger for too long in that thought. Instead, he reminded himself of what he'd learned over the past few weeks. Soreness didn't mean failure. It meant progress. It meant that his body was responding to the changes he'd been making. He stretched slowly, gently. His muscles had grown used to the routine now, and although they still protested some mornings, they no longer felt like they were breaking down. His recovery wasn't a straight line, it had its ups and downs, but that was part of the process. He had learned to accept that. The morning sun streamed through the window as Jake made his way to the kitchen. His breakfast was simple, as usual, scrambled eggs with spinach and a side of avocado. He'd stuck to the same meals for weeks now, not because he was bored, but because he knew they worked. His body had started to crave these healthy foods, which was something he never thought would happen. There was a time when his taste buds only craved greasy fast food or a burger, but now, his body seemed to demand the nourishment it had been deprived of for so long. As he sat down at the table, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Emily. "Hey, Dad. Just wanted to check in. How's everything going?" Jake smiled as he typed his reply. "It's going well. I'm sticking to the routine, working on the Mustang, and feeling a little stronger every day. Thanks for asking." He put the phone down, taking a sip of his coffee, and glanced out the window at the neighborhood. It had become his ritual in the mornings to take a few moments to reflect. No matter how small, he appreciated the moments of peace he had before the world around him got busy. Later that day, Jake headed out for his daily walk. He had noticed that it was getting easier. The walk, once a challenge, had now become a part of his day that he looked forward to. The rhythm of his steps, the fresh air, the quiet hum of the world, it all helped to clear his mind. And today, he felt particularly at ease as he walked down the familiar street. But that ease didn't last long. As Jake neared the corner of the block, he saw someone he hadn't expected, his old friend, Mark, leaning against the fence of his front yard. Mark was the type of guy who always seemed to have everything together. He'd been a successful business owner, lived in a big house, and was always in good shape. It wasn't a surprise that Jake hadn't seen him in months. Their lives had drifted apart for a number of reasons. Some of them Jake's fault, some of them Mark's. "Jake. Hey, man." Mark called out, waving him over. Jake hesitated for a moment. He hadn't been sure how to reconnect with Mark after all this time. Their last conversation had ended in frustration. Mark had never understood Jake's decision to step away from his fast-paced life, to slow down. He'd always pushed Jake to work harder, do more. But still, Jake found himself walking toward him. "Hey, Mark. How've you been?" Jake asked, his tone polite but guarded. Mark grinned. Same old, same old. Been keeping busy with the business. You know how it is. But I've been thinking about you lately. I haven't seen you around much. What's going on?" Jake paused, unsure how much to share. He didn't want to go into the whole story of his health struggles, his quest for balance, or how he was slowly rebuilding his life. It felt like too much to explain. Instead, he gave a vague response. I've been focusing on some personal stuff. Trying to take better care of myself. Mark raised an eyebrow. Taking care of yourself? Man, you were always in shape. I didn't think you had much to work on there. But hey, if you need help, you know I've got some great personal trainers. I could hook you up with someone. Jake felt the familiar pressure of Mark's words. It wasn't the first time he had heard this kind of suggestion, and it was exactly what he didn't want. He didn't need a trainer to push him harder. He didn't need someone to tell him to do more, to keep going until he dropped. What he needed was balance. But how could he explain that to Mark? I appreciate it, but I'm actually trying something a little different now. It's not about pushing harder or doing more. It's about listening to my body and finding a pace that works for me. Mark seemed taken aback for a moment, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. I don't know, Jake. I've always believed in pushing yourself. You've got to go after it, you know. This whole slow down thing. I don't know if it's gonna get you the results you want. Jake's stomach tightened at Mark's words. He could feel the old pressures rising up, pressures he had worked so hard to get away from. He wanted to argue, to explain that he didn't want to live in constant pursuit of more. But he stopped himself. Arguing wouldn't change anything. Mark had his own way of thinking, and Jake had his. Instead, Jake simply nodded. I get where you're coming from, but this is what feels right for me right now. Mark shrugged, clearly unconvinced, and said, well, hey, if you need anything, let me know. But remember, you don't want to fall too far behind. Jake forced a smile, feeling a little bit of resentment bubbling up. It wasn't easy to have these kinds of conversations. But he had to stay strong in his resolve. He wasn't going back to that mindset of constant pressure. Not again. Later that evening, after he had dinner, Jake sat on the porch, thinking about his encounter with Mark. He had felt the old doubts creeping in, the whispers that maybe he was taking the easy way out, that slowing down was a sign of weakness. But he shook off those thoughts. The truth was, it was harder to slow down than to keep pushing. Slowing down required discipline of a different kind. It required patience and self-compassion. And, more than anything, it required trust in the process. Jake knew that. He was finally learning that. Maggie joined him outside, sitting beside him on the porch swing. Everything okay? She asked, noticing the look on his face. Yeah, just, had an interesting conversation with Mark today, Jake replied. He's still stuck in that mindset of pushing harder, doing more. It's hard not to get pulled back into that thinking. Maggie smiled softly, her voice steady and reassuring. Jake, you don't have to prove anything to him. You're on your own journey. Just keep doing what feels right for you. You've made so much progress already. Jake let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift a little. He was getting better at letting go of the opinions of others. He didn't need to justify his choices to anyone. He knew where he was headed, and it wasn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about being the healthiest, both physically and mentally. As the days continued, Jake's resolve grew stronger. He wasn't going to let the doubts or pressures of others derail him. He had learned that the path to healing wasn't about meeting other people's expectations, it was about meeting his own. And that was a challenge that he was more than ready to face. Jake had always been the kind of guy who liked to see results immediately. His entire life had been a series of fast-paced actions, working hard, pushing through, and achieving success. But now, with each passing day, he was starting to realize how difficult it was to adopt a mindset of patience. It wasn't just about his muscles or his physical health anymore. It was about learning how to trust the process of life, to let go of the constant need for control. It wasn't easy. The morning after his conversation with Mark, Jake woke up to find that the soreness in his legs had deepened. The walk from the previous day had clearly taken a toll on his muscles. But instead of seeing it as a setback, he saw it for what it was, a sign of growth. Even the soreness was a part of the healing. He had learned that by now. Jake decided to take it easy that day. No strenuous exercise, no long walks. Instead, he spent the morning in the garage again, working on the Mustang. There was something about the familiar sound of the tools, the scent of oil, and the rhythm of his hands working on the car that calmed him. It was his escape, a way to focus without forcing his body to do more than it could handle. As he worked, his mind wandered to his conversation with Mark. It was clear that his old friend still didn't understand why Jake was making the changes he was. Mark's world was one of instant results, of pushing limits, of seeing immediate rewards for hard work. But Jake knew that wasn't his path anymore. Slow and steady, he whispered to himself, recalling the advice Emily had given him weeks ago. It had been hard to embrace, but it was beginning to make sense. He took a deep breath and tightened a bolt on the car. The muscle aches in his body didn't feel as painful now, not because they had gone away but because Jake was beginning to shift his perspective. The soreness was just a part of the journey. It wasn't an obstacle to overcome, it was a sign that he was working towards something. The power of patience, of doing the right thing at the right time, was starting to sink in. Later that afternoon, Jake sat down with his meal, scrambled eggs, spinach, and avocado, just like every day. His diet had become a key part of his new routine. It wasn't just about eating the right foods to heal his muscles, it was about fueling his body properly. He felt better than he ever had in years, clearer, more energized, and, in many ways, stronger. He glanced at his phone again, seeing a text from Emily. "Dad, are you free later? I was thinking of coming by for a visit." Jake smiled. It had been a while since they'd spent any quality time together, and he looked forward to seeing her. Emily had been his rock through all of this, offering support, encouragement, and a healthy perspective on life. He always felt like he could talk to her about anything. "Of course. Come on by whenever. I'm just working on the car." As soon as he hit send, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. His relationship with Emily had grown even stronger throughout his journey. They had both been through difficult times, but these moments of connection made the struggles seem worth it. They weren't just father and daughter anymore, they were partners in this journey of life, navigating it together. When Emily arrived later, Jake greeted her with a hug. She looked as lively as ever, her eyes sparkling with energy. They sat down together at the kitchen table, and Emily began to chat about her work and the things going on in her life. But Jake couldn't help but notice that Emily's attention kept drifting back to him. She looked at him in a way that made him feel like she was seeing him more clearly than he saw himself sometimes. It was as if she could tell how much he had changed, how much he had grown. "Dad," Emily said after a pause, "I can tell you've been working hard on your health. But I'm wondering, how are you really doing?" Jake hesitated for a moment. It was a question that made him feel vulnerable, and he wasn't always comfortable with vulnerability. But Emily was different. She had always been there for him, even when things were tough. "I'm doing better, Em. It's slow, but I'm learning a lot. Some days are harder than others, but I'm figuring out that this whole process isn't about doing more. It's about doing things the right way, even if it takes time." Emily nodded, understanding. "I've noticed. You seem calmer. More present. And it's really inspiring to watch you go through this transformation. It's not easy to let go of the old ways, but you're doing it." Jake felt a warmth spread through him. He hadn't expected Emily to see it so clearly, but her words made him realize just how far he had come. It wasn't just about the physical strength he had been working on. It was about mental and emotional growth as well. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "It's been hard to break old habits, to stop pushing so hard. But I've learned that healing isn't about rushing. It's about giving yourself the space to grow, even if it's slower than you want." There was a long pause as Emily considered his words. Then she smiled softly. "You're doing great, Dad. I know it's hard, but you're showing me what real strength looks like. And it's not just about the muscles. It's about patience and persistence. You're teaching me that every day. Jake felt his chest tighten with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. It was easy to get caught up in the desire for instant results, to focus on the destination rather than the journey. But in that moment, he understood, his journey wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting an example for those around him. It was about showing Emily, and himself, that true strength was built over time, one patient step at a time. That evening, after Emily had left, Jake sat on the porch again, the sunset painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. The day had been peaceful, and he felt a deep sense of contentment. His muscles were still sore, but that didn't bother him anymore. He had made progress. In the quiet of the evening, he reflected on what he had learned over the past few weeks. He realized that the hardest part of the process wasn't the physical work, it was learning to be patient with himself, to trust that the changes he was making would come in their own time. It wasn't always easy to embrace the slow path. He still had moments of doubt, times when he wished he could fast forward through the healing. But as the sun set and the cool evening air began to settle in, he realized that patience was its own kind of strength. And that strength, he knew, would carry him through whatever came next. Jake woke up early the next morning, a little earlier than usual. The quiet of the house was comforting, and the early hours had always been his time to reflect. He lay in bed for a few minutes, letting his mind wander through the thoughts and feelings of the past few days. The soreness in his muscles was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. He could feel the steady progress his body was making, and yet, there was something else that had been quietly creeping up on him lately, doubt. No matter how much he told himself that he was on the right path, there were moments when the whispers of his old mindset would return, telling him that he wasn't doing enough, that he needed to push harder, faster, to get things done. Was he really getting stronger? Or was he just taking it easy, settling for less? He forced himself to sit up and swing his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the floor with a soft thud, the cool hardwood a reminder of how much had changed in his life, from his health to his approach to everything. Jake stared at his reflection in the mirror for a moment, searching his face for any signs of weakness. But there was nothing. No tiredness, no defeat. Just the look of a man who was learning to be okay with himself, even when things weren't perfect. With a sigh, Jake decided to go for a walk. His morning routine had become a source of clarity. He had learned over the weeks that moving his body helped him process his thoughts. The simple act of walking, feeling his feet hit the pavement, gave him the time to reflect and ground himself. As Jake walked through the neighborhood, the familiar streets offered no answers, but they did give him something more. They reminded him that, despite the doubts, life kept moving forward. The world didn't wait for perfection. Things changed slowly, sometimes painfully, but they always moved in a direction. Still, the question lingered. Was he truly improving? Was the effort he was putting into his health making a difference, or was it all in vain? He knew it wasn't about immediate results, but a part of him, maybe the part that had been so used to instant gratification, struggled with the uncertainty. The walk was peaceful, but Jake's mind refused to settle. Every step seemed to carry with it another doubt, another question. What if he was just wasting time? What if, despite all the changes, he was still falling short of what he could be? The echo of Mark's words, from that conversation a few days ago, came back to him. You don't want to fall too far behind. They had been casual, but the weight of them had stuck with Jake. It was hard to ignore that voice, even if it came from a place that didn't fully understand his journey. By the time Jake reached the park, his walk had turned into a slow march of reflection. He sat down on a bench, staring across the green expanse. It was a beautiful day, but the shadows of doubt clouded his mind. Just then, his phone buzzed, and he saw it was a text from Emily. Hey, I was thinking, have you checked in with your doctor recently? Maybe it's time to get a second opinion on how things are going with your health. I know you're doing great, but it wouldn't hurt to check in. Jake paused for a moment before responding. He knew Emily was only looking out for him. But the thought of seeing a doctor again stirred up some old fears. He had been so focused on the process, on trusting his body, that the idea of seeing someone else evaluate his progress felt like a step back. Still, Emily's words made sense. It had been a while since his last checkup, and he had made significant changes to his routine. It wouldn't hurt to hear an expert's perspective on his progress, even if it meant confronting some of those lingering doubts. He typed a quick response. "I'll call the doctor today. Thanks for the reminder." The moment he sent it, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. Sometimes, checking in with the people who cared about him was exactly what he needed to feel grounded. When Jake returned home, he made the call to his doctor. The conversation was brief, but the appointment was scheduled for the following week. As soon as he hung up, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He didn't want to depend on outside validation, but there was a part of him that needed it. The truth was, the doubt he had been feeling wasn't just about his physical health. It was about his approach to life, about whether he was doing enough, whether his choices were truly leading him to the person he wanted to be. The next few days were filled with a combination of normal routine and internal struggle. Jake stuck to his workouts, made sure to eat his meals, and kept working on the Mustang. But each day, the doubt seemed to grow louder. He found himself comparing his progress to others, wondering if the changes he was making were really making a difference. Was his body truly transforming, or was he just convincing himself of something that wasn't real? The day of his doctor's appointment arrived, and Jake walked into the clinic with a sense of apprehension. He had been in this place before, seated in waiting rooms, unsure of what to expect. But now, everything felt different. He wasn't just there for an evaluation of his physical health, he was seeking confirmation of the choices he had made. He wanted someone to tell him that the changes were working, that the progress he was making was real. When the doctor finally called him in, they exchanged pleasantries before getting down to business. After a series of tests and measurements, the doctor sat down with him and reviewed the results. "Jake, I have to say, I'm impressed," the doctor said. "The improvements in your muscle mass and overall strength are significant. Your blood pressure is lower, and your cholesterol is in a much healthier range. These are the kinds of results I would expect from someone who's been working hard on their health. You're on the right track." Jake felt a rush of relief. But as much as the doctor's words were comforting, he realized that the most important validation had come from within himself. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not even to a doctor. The work he had been putting in was making a difference, not just physically but mentally and emotionally as well. Later that evening, Jake sat on the porch again, the cool breeze lifting his spirits. The doubts that had plagued him for so long didn't feel as heavy anymore. He had received validation, yes, but more importantly, he had given it to himself. He thought about all the progress he had made, slowly, steadily, and he felt a deep sense of peace. He was exactly where he needed to be. And though the doubts might return from time to time, he now knew how to handle them. They didn't define him. They were just echoes, fading as the true strength inside him continued to grow. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake woke up earlier than usual the following morning, his mind already buzzing with a mix of anticipation and curiosity. The events of the past few days had left him with a sense of quiet confidence, but there was still a lingering feeling of uncertainty. It was as if his progress was just starting to settle in, like a puzzle that had yet to be fully completed. He wasn't sure exactly what the next step was, but he knew that he had to keep moving forward. One small step at a time. The soreness from his last workout was still there, but it wasn't nearly as debilitating as it had been. Instead of seeing it as a negative sign, Jake now viewed it as a badge of honor. His muscles were adapting, growing stronger. Every ache, every twinge, was a reminder of the hard work he had been putting in, the sacrifices he had made to turn his life around. Still, he knew that success wasn't just about physical gains. It wasn't about lifting heavier weights or running longer distances. The real transformation was internal, a shift in his mindset. He had spent so many years focused on instant results, on the big, dramatic moments of success, but now he was starting to see the power in the small wins, the daily victories that added up over time. As Jake went about his morning routine, preparing his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and spinach, he felt a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for years. The quiet morning ritual was grounding, a reminder that the little things mattered just as much as the big things. He had come to understand that health was a holistic journey, mental, emotional, and physical, and every choice he made, no matter how small, was a victory. After eating, Jake decided to take a walk through the park again. The weather was crisp, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the trees. As he walked, he reflected on how far he had come. When he first started his journey, it had been overwhelming. The idea of changing his entire life, his diet, his exercise habits, his mental approach to everything, had seemed like an insurmountable challenge. But now, he realized that it wasn't about any one major moment of change. It was the accumulation of countless small steps that had led him here. Each walk, each meal, each workout had been a building block in the foundation of his new life. At the park, Jake ran into a neighbor he hadn't seen in a while, Danny, a man in his mid-40s who had always been friendly but a little too caught up in his own busy life. Danny smiled when he saw Jake, and they exchanged a quick handshake. "Hey, Jake. You've been looking good, man. Been hitting the gym?" Jake grinned, a little surprised by the compliment. "Yeah, I've been trying to stay on track. Nothing crazy, just working on being healthier overall." Danny raised an eyebrow. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. I need to take some of that advice. I've been meaning to get into shape myself." Jake chuckled, nodding. "It's all about taking small steps. Don't try to change everything at once. Just start with one thing, and let it build from there." Danny seemed to take this to heart. "Small steps, huh? I like that. Maybe I'll start walking every day." Jake's smile grew. It was a small interaction, but it reminded him of something important, the impact his journey was having on others. Even the smallest changes in his life could inspire those around him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing people that they could make positive changes too, no matter where they started. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Jake worked on the Mustang in the garage, making slow but steady progress. He didn't rush the work, instead, he focused on doing each step with care, making sure that everything was done right. It felt good, this sense of control and focus. He wasn't in a race, and he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just doing what needed to be done, one step at a time. Later in the day, Jake decided to follow through on his commitment to check in with his doctor. He had been thinking a lot about the appointment, and while the idea of another evaluation made him a little nervous, he knew it was important. When he arrived at the clinic, the waiting room was quiet, and the receptionist smiled when she saw him. "Jake. It's good to see you. You're looking great, how have things been?" "Thanks, it's been good. Just trying to stay consistent with everything," Jake replied, feeling the nerves he hadn't expected to surface. Soon, he was called back to the exam room, and the familiar routine began, the weight check, the blood pressure check, and a brief chat with the doctor about his progress. The doctor asked Jake how he was feeling and whether he had noticed any changes, and Jake smiled as he explained the steady improvements he had experienced, his energy levels, his mood, his muscle strength. The doctor nodded along, his expression thoughtful. "You've been making great strides, Jake. It's clear you're doing the right things. The small wins add up, and you're seeing the results." Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just the doctor's approval, it was the validation of everything he had been learning. That even when things seemed small, when they didn't feel like big, dramatic changes, they were still moving him forward. After leaving the doctor's office, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't doing this for the immediate reward or the recognition. He was doing it for himself, because he knew that every small step, every day that he stayed on track, brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. Later that evening, he sat down at the kitchen table, enjoying a simple meal of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. Emily had texted him earlier, asking how the appointment went, and he had replied with an update. She was happy to hear the good news, and he could hear the pride in her voice when she called him later that night. "You're doing amazing, Dad. I'm so proud of you. I know it's not easy, but you're proving to yourself that you can do this." Jake smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Thanks, Em. It's all about those small wins. They add up faster than you think." That night, as Jake sat on the porch, watching the stars twinkle in the clear sky, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't about the dramatic moments, the big accomplishments. It was the steady progress, the small victories that had been building up over time. For the first time in a long time, Jake realized that he wasn't chasing an end goal. He was living in the moment, enjoying the journey. And with each small win, he was getting closer to the person he had always wanted to become. The journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fast. But the small steps mattered, more than he had ever imagined. Jake sat at the breakfast table the next morning, staring at his oatmeal, but not really seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, floating through the past few weeks of progress, doubts, small wins, and personal victories. For the first time in a long time, things felt stable, too stable. The excitement of seeing progress had started to wear off, and now, he found himself facing something he hadn't encountered in a while, the plateau. A few weeks ago, Jake had been riding high on the physical and emotional highs that came with real progress. His energy was up, his muscle definition had improved, and his stamina was better than it had been in years. But now, despite his consistent effort, something had changed. The gains weren't as noticeable, the progress wasn't as evident. His body felt like it had stopped responding to the work he'd been putting in. He had heard about plateaus before, when someone works so hard, but their progress stalls. It was a phenomenon he'd read about, but never really understood until now. Was he stuck? Was this the point where all the effort started to feel meaningless? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Mark. "Hey, Jake. How's everything going? We still on for the weekend ride?" Jake's fingers hovered over the screen, the words almost taunting him. He hadn't told Mark about the plateau. He wasn't sure how to explain it. After all, wasn't Mark the guy who was always pushing hard? Would he understand that Jake was struggling, even after all the effort? Or would Mark simply see it as a sign of weakness? Before he could overthink it, he quickly typed back. "Yeah, looking forward to it. Need a little break from the routine." That was the truth, in a way. He needed a break, but from his own doubts, not the actual progress. He wanted to be around friends, to feel that spark of motivation again. Maybe the ride would help clear his head. Later that afternoon, Jake walked into the garage to check on the Mustang, trying to distract himself from the feeling of being stuck. His progress on the car had slowed too, he wasn't as excited about the project as he had been in the beginning. The same feeling of stagnation seemed to be creeping into every part of his life. As he lifted the hood of the car, he stared at the engine, which was almost complete. The sense of satisfaction was gone. It wasn't that he wasn't proud of how far he had come, it was that the next step felt too daunting. He didn't know how to get past this point, this invisible wall that had appeared in his journey. That evening, as he sat down to dinner with Emily, she could tell something was on his mind. "Dad, you seem a little off tonight. What's going on?" Jake hesitated, chewing a bite of his grilled chicken before answering. "I don't know, Em. I guess I'm just stuck. I thought things were going great, but lately, it feels like I'm not making any more progress. The workouts, the meals, they just don't seem to be having the same effect anymore. Emily looked thoughtful for a moment before responding. You know, I read something about plateaus in fitness once. It said that they're a normal part of the process. Everyone hits them, even the best athletes. The trick is to change things up. Sometimes your body just needs a new challenge. Jake raised an eyebrow. A new challenge? Like what? She shrugged. Maybe you could try mixing up your workouts. Do something totally different. Or change your routine. You're always doing the same things, right? Maybe your body's just used to it. Jake hadn't considered that. It made sense. If his body was used to the same routine, maybe that was why things weren't changing anymore. He had to shake things up, push his boundaries in new ways. Yeah, maybe I'll try that, he said thoughtfully. Thanks, Em. She smiled, her eyes full of warmth. You got this, Dad. Remember, progress isn't always linear. You'll break through it. The next day, Jake took Emily's advice to heart. He didn't jump into a completely new routine just yet, but he started thinking about how he could introduce more variety. The same old routine wasn't going to cut it anymore. He needed to push himself differently. He decided to switch up his cardio. Instead of sticking to the treadmill, he took a trip to a local hiking trail. The thought of fresh air, new scenery, and a physical challenge that wasn't part of his usual routine lifted his spirits. The trail was steeper than he anticipated, but that only made it more rewarding. As he hiked higher, he could feel the burn in his legs, the familiar soreness that was both painful and satisfying. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was challenging himself again. The next few days were filled with small changes. He added new exercises to his strength training. He made an effort to eat new foods, experimenting with meals that included different sources of protein and vegetables. He found new hobbies that kept him active but weren't directly related to his usual workout routine. He spent more time with Mark, engaging in long talks about fitness and life, and it reignited his passion for personal growth. Through it all, Jake realized that the plateau wasn't a sign of failure. It was a signal that his body, and his mind, had adapted to his routine. It wasn't that he wasn't progressing, it was that his progress needed a new spark, a new challenge. A few days later, Jake was on the weekend ride with Mark. The wind was in his face as they cruised through the winding roads. It was an exhilarating feeling, not just because of the ride, but because it symbolized something much bigger. He had broken through the plateau. He had taken a step back, reassessed, and found the courage to keep pushing forward. As they pulled into a small diner for a break, Mark looked over at Jake with a grin. You're looking better, man. I can see it. You're not just talking about pushing yourself, you're actually doing it. Jake smiled back, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I had to break through the plateau. Change things up a bit. Mark chuckled. It's always like that. Just when you think you've hit a wall, you realize you can go around it instead of trying to climb it. Jake nodded, taking in the truth of Mark's words. The plateau wasn't the end of the road, it was just a curve, a detour, part of the process. And now that he was on the other side of it, he felt stronger than ever. That night, as he lay in bed reflecting on the day, Jake realized something important. He wasn't just changing his body. He was changing how he viewed challenges, how he approached obstacles. The journey wasn't always going to be easy, and it wasn't always going to be linear. But as long as he kept moving forward, even in small ways, he would continue to grow. And that, he thought, was the real victory. The next morning, Jake woke up with a renewed sense of energy. The plateau seemed like a distant memory now, a challenge he had overcome by embracing change. Yet, as he stood in front of the mirror, he couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that he was still missing something. The physical changes were noticeable, his muscles were more defined, his endurance was better, but there was a deeper longing inside of him. It wasn't just about physical strength anymore. He had spent so much time focusing on transforming his body that he had neglected something just as important, his mindset. For the first time, Jake realized that the true challenge wasn't about reaching an ideal weight or achieving a specific number on the bench press. The real challenge was embracing the unknown, confronting the parts of himself he hadn't yet explored, and expanding his boundaries in ways he had never considered before. Jake had always considered himself a creature of habit. His days followed a predictable routine, from the time he woke up to the time he went to bed. Even his workouts, although varied now, were still built on a structure he felt comfortable with. But something had shifted in him over the past few weeks. As he broke through the plateau, he felt the urge to push himself further, to test himself in ways he hadn't thought possible. It was time for something different. He didn't want to live his life always within the limits of what he knew. He needed to step into the unknown. After breakfast, Jake spent a few hours researching new fitness challenges online. He came across a trail running event happening in the mountains about 3 hours away from his home. The race was tough, intense, and required a level of endurance he hadn't yet built up, but something about it intrigued him. It wasn't just about running, it was about testing his limits in a completely new environment. Without thinking too much about it, he signed up. The race wasn't for another month, but just the act of committing to something unknown filled him with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. For the first time in a while, he was stepping into something he had no control over, no certainty about. And that was exactly what he needed. The rest of the day was spent preparing. Jake knew that the trail run would demand more than just physical strength. He needed mental preparation too. The idea of running through rough terrain, over rocks and through thick woods, terrified him. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that concerned him, it was the fear of failing in front of strangers, of not being able to push himself hard enough. But as he reflected on his journey so far, he realized that every fear, every doubt, had been a stepping stone. His first workout had felt overwhelming, too, but he had pushed through. His first day of eating healthier had been filled with cravings and temptation, but he had stuck to it. Each of these moments had led him to where he was today. This trail run would be no different. That night, as he sat down for dinner with Emily, he shared his plans. "Dad, you're really going for it, huh?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Jake smiled. "Yeah, I guess I am. I signed up for this trail race. It's in the mountains. I'll be running through mud, rocks, it's going to be tough." Emily's eyes sparkled. "That's awesome. I'm proud of you. It's so cool to see you pushing yourself in new ways." Jake paused, grateful for her support. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I've spent so much time focusing on the physical changes, but now I feel like I need to challenge myself mentally, too. I can't just stay in my comfort zone forever." Emily nodded. "You've already come so far. I know you can do this." Jake chuckled. "I'm going to give it my best shot, that's for sure." As the days passed, Jake ramped up his training. He incorporated trail running into his routine, practicing on uneven ground near the park. The first few attempts were brutal. His legs ached with every step, and he stumbled more times than he cared to admit. The fear of failure gnawed at him, especially as he compared himself to others he saw on the trails who seemed so much more skilled, so much more prepared. But something changed as he kept going. Every time he fell, he got back up. Every time he felt like stopping, he pushed a little further. It was in these moments of discomfort, of pushing beyond what he thought he was capable of, that he began to realize how much mental strength he had developed without even knowing it. The physical aspects of the training were hard, no doubt. But it was the mental battle that was the most challenging. Learning to silence the voice in his head that told him to quit, to embrace the pain and keep moving forward, that was the real breakthrough. A week before the race, Jake found himself standing at the edge of the park, staring at the trail he had been practicing on for weeks. He was more prepared than he had been before, but he also knew the real test was still to come. The race in the mountains would be unlike anything he had faced before. That evening, he called Mark to tell him about his upcoming challenge. "You're really doing it, huh?" Mark asked, impressed. "That's amazing, Jake. I'm proud of you." Jake laughed. "I'm not sure if I'm ready, but I signed up, so I guess I'll just have to do my best." Mark's voice was full of encouragement. "You've been pushing yourself this whole time. Trust yourself. You've got the mental strength, too. You just have to embrace the unknown." Jake's heart surged at Mark's words. This was the advice he needed, the reassurance that his decision wasn't reckless. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about the willingness to step into the unknown, to face fear and uncertainty, and to come out stronger on the other side. The morning of the race, Jake woke up early, his nerves a mixture of excitement and dread. He had trained hard, but nothing could prepare him for the challenge that lay ahead. As he laced up his shoes, he felt a strange calmness come over him. This was it. The moment he had been working toward. Emily gave him a tight hug before he left. "You're going to crush it, Dad. Just remember, it's not about winning. It's about pushing yourself. You've got this." Jake smiled, his heart full. "Thanks, Em. I'm going to do my best." As Jake made his way to the start line, he looked around at the other participants. Some of them were experienced runners, their bodies honed for the rough terrain. Others, like him, looked nervous and unsure of what they had gotten themselves into. The gunshot went off, and the crowd surged forward. Jake's breath quickened as he took his first steps. The trail was unforgiving, with sharp inclines and uneven rocks. His body was already sore from the first mile, but he kept moving forward. He could feel the sweat dripping down his face, his muscles screaming for relief, but he didn't stop. He wasn't racing against anyone else. He wasn't trying to beat a specific time. He was racing against himself, against the doubts, the fear, the uncertainty. And with each step, he was winning. By the time Jake crossed the finish line, he was exhausted, his legs shaking and his breath ragged. But when he looked up, a huge grin spread across his face. He had done it. He had faced the unknown, stepped out of his comfort zone, and completed something he never thought possible. It wasn't the end of the journey. But it was a powerful reminder that the greatest challenges in life weren't the ones that seemed the hardest. They were the ones that forced you to grow, to embrace the unknown, and to discover parts of yourself you never knew existed. Jake stood on the edge of the mountain, staring down at the winding trail below. His heart was pounding in his chest, not just from the physical exertion of the race, but from the realization that he had just accomplished something he never thought possible. He had faced the unknown, pushed his body to its limits, and finished the race, all while battling the self-doubt that had plagued him for so long. But even as he caught his breath and surveyed the finish line in the distance, Jake knew that something deeper had happened on that mountain. He hadn't just tested his physical limits. He had tested his mind, his determination, his ability to fight through the voices in his head telling him to quit. And in that moment, Jake realized that the real power behind his transformation wasn't just the strength of his muscles, it was the strength of his mind. The days after the race were filled with a sense of pride that Jake hadn't felt in a long time. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone different. Not just physically, though he was still in the best shape of his life. No, the transformation was deeper than that. His confidence had grown, his outlook on life had shifted, and he began to see that the mental hurdles he'd been facing were just as important as the physical ones. He hadn't always been aware of the power of his mind, but now he understood. Every decision he made, every challenge he faced, came down to how he viewed himself and his ability to overcome. The moments when he felt exhausted, when he wanted to give up, were the moments that defined him. And those were the moments when his mind would either lead him to victory or to failure. It wasn't just about the body anymore. It was about the mind. The mind was what kept him going, what allowed him to push through barriers. And that understanding became his new secret weapon. That evening, after a long day at work, Jake sat down to unwind, flipping through a book he'd picked up on mental conditioning. It was something he had never really thought about before, the idea that the mind could be trained as effectively as the body. But after his experience on the mountain, it made sense. He had witnessed firsthand how powerful the mind could be. He had seen how it could push him through the toughest moments, how it could keep him going when his body wanted to stop. As he read, he came across a passage that struck him: the greatest victories are won in the mind. When the mind is strong, the body will follow. It was a simple concept, but one that Jake hadn't fully embraced until now. His journey so far had been about strengthening his body, but now, it was time to focus on his mind. The following week, Jake began practicing mental conditioning. He started each day with positive affirmations, simple statements that reminded him of his strength, his potential, and his ability to overcome challenges. At first, it felt awkward, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to speaking to himself in such an empowering way. But as the days went by, he noticed a shift. The affirmations started to sink in. He found himself feeling more confident, more resilient. He also began practicing mindfulness and meditation. He would spend 10 minutes each morning focusing on his breath, clearing his mind, and grounding himself in the present moment. It wasn't easy at first, especially with his busy schedule, but Jake quickly realized how much of an impact it had on his stress levels and his overall sense of calm. He felt more in control, more centered. As Jake continued to work on his mental strength, he noticed changes in other areas of his life as well. He found himself tackling challenges at work with more clarity and focus. He was more present with Emily and his friends. He approached every situation with a sense of calm and confidence, no longer allowing self-doubt to dictate his actions. It wasn't just about training his mind to be positive, it was about training it to be resilient. He knew that life would continue to throw challenges his way. There would always be obstacles, setbacks, and moments of self-doubt. But now, he had the tools to face them head-on. He understood that the mind had the power to either hold him back or propel him forward. And he was ready to let it propel him. A month after the race, Jake met up with Mark for their usual weekend ride. As they sat down for a coffee afterward, Mark couldn't help but notice the change in Jake. "You're a different guy, man," Mark said with a grin. "I can see it in the way you talk, the way you move. You've got a new energy about you." Jake smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. "I've been focusing on something different lately. I realize that the physical stuff is just part of the equation. The mind is just as important." Mark raised an eyebrow. "The mind?" Jake nodded. "Yeah. I've been working on mental conditioning, things like affirmations, mindfulness, just training my mind to be as strong as my body. It's made a huge difference." Mark leaned back in his chair, impressed. "That's amazing, man. It's like you've unlocked a whole new level of strength." Jake chuckled. "It feels like that. I used to think I was just limited to what I could do physically, but now I realize it's all connected. The mind has so much power." Mark gave him a knowing look. "That's the key. It's always been about the mind. You've got the muscle, now you're building the mindset." Jake nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The changes weren't just about how he looked or how strong he had become. They were about who he had become. And that realization was the most powerful transformation of all. That evening, as Jake sat in the quiet of his living room, he thought about the road he had traveled, both physically and mentally. He had come so far, but the journey was far from over. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew that with his body and mind working together, there was nothing he couldn't overcome. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the stillness. The man who had once felt lost, unsure of himself, was now someone who had unlocked the greatest strength of all, the power of the mind. Jake had always believed that success in fitness and life was simply about pushing through the physical limits, enduring the pain, and overcoming obstacles. But as he sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee, he realized that something even deeper had been at play in his transformation. Something far more subtle and often overlooked, the unseen forces of discipline, consistency, and mindset. These weren't just temporary habits, they were the foundational shifts in how he viewed himself and his life. And now, those forces were propelling him into new realms of possibility. He had spent months working on his physical strength, and weeks on strengthening his mental focus, but as he looked back at everything he'd achieved, it became clear, the real power behind his transformation wasn't just in the actions he'd taken, it was in the consistency and the unseen forces that had guided every step of the way. That afternoon, while taking a break from work, Jake picked up his phone and scrolled through social media. As always, there were countless posts about workouts, diets, supplements, and fitness transformations. He couldn't help but notice how often people celebrated drastic, quick results, fitness journeys that boasted quick fixes, rapid weight loss, or sudden muscle gain. While he had seen the value in quick wins during his journey, Jake knew firsthand that lasting change required more than that. It required a deep, underlying commitment to consistency, small actions, and steady progress, things most people didn't see in the flashy Instagram posts or quick recipe blog posts. The next time he met with Mark, they both talked about this very idea, the hidden side of fitness that no one ever mentioned. Mark had always been the more pragmatic one. He saw through the shiny distractions and understood that true growth, in both fitness and life, came from incremental improvements. "You know, Jake," Mark said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I've been thinking a lot about the things that keep us going. It's not just about the workouts or the meals, it's the daily grind, the little things that no one really notices." Jake nodded, recalling the countless mornings when he had woken up tired, sore, and mentally drained, but still managed to stick to his routine. It wasn't always about being at his best. It was about showing up, day after day. Exactly. It's about being consistent when no one is watching. It's the small choices you make every day that add up to the bigger picture, Jake replied. Mark grinned. "I call it the unseen forces. People focus on the big moments, the races, the competitions, the dramatic weight loss, but they forget that real change is happening in the quiet moments. It's the mornings when you don't feel like working out, but you get up anyway. It's the nights when you want to skip a healthy meal, but you don't. Those are the forces that create lasting change." Jake had always admired Mark's straightforward approach to fitness and life. Mark wasn't the type of person to boast about his achievements or share every detail on social media. He just did the work. And it was that consistency, those invisible moments of discipline, that had earned him success in every area of his life. Jake realized that Mark's words weren't just about fitness. They applied to everything. The more he thought about it, the more Jake realized that the unseen forces didn't just apply to his workouts or diet. They applied to his relationships, his career, and his overall mindset. In every aspect of life, the real strength came not from flashy victories, but from the slow, quiet work that went on behind the scenes. The strength of a lasting marriage, the strength of a thriving business, or the strength of a community wasn't built on big moments. It was built on the countless small decisions, day after day, that led to a stronger foundation. Later that week, Jake found himself walking through the grocery store with Emily. As they passed the aisles of junk food and sugary snacks, Emily pointed to a shelf of her favorite candy. "Dad, can we get some of these?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. Jake smiled, feeling that familiar pang of temptation. It was easy to give in to moments like this, especially when it would make her happy. But then he remembered the unseen forces, the small decisions that added up over time. He took a deep breath and made his decision. "How about we pick up some fresh fruit instead?" he suggested. "We can make smoothies at home. We'll both enjoy them, and they'll be healthier for us." Emily looked at him, a little disappointed, but after a moment, she smiled. "Okay, smoothies sound good. Jake felt a quiet satisfaction in his choice. It wasn't a dramatic decision, it wasn't a grand gesture or a moment of triumph. It was simply a small, consistent choice that aligned with the changes he had made in his life. As the days passed, Jake continued to focus on making small decisions that supported his long-term goals. He kept pushing forward with his workouts, fine-tuning his nutrition, and practicing his mental exercises. But he was no longer obsessed with the big moments. He had learned that real strength was forged in the moments that went unnoticed. It was in the mundane, the routine, the moments when the world wasn't watching, that he was truly growing. One evening, as he and Emily sat down for dinner, she looked at him with curiosity. "Dad, I've noticed something. You don't talk about your workouts as much anymore. You just do them, like it's normal." Jake smiled at her, taking a bite of his salad. "Well, that's because it's become a part of my routine now. I don't need to talk about it as much because it's just who I am. It's not about the flashy moments anymore. It's about doing the work every day." Emily looked thoughtful, nodding slowly. "That's kind of cool. It's like you've made it a habit." Jake leaned back in his chair. "Exactly. When something becomes a habit, you don't need to force it. You just do it because it's a part of who you are." Later that evening, as Jake prepared for bed, he reflected on his journey. He had started out seeking quick fixes, looking for the next big challenge to push him to his limits. But over time, he had come to understand that the real power lay not in the grand victories, but in the unseen forces that guided him every single day. His transformation wasn't just about muscle or endurance. It was about the invisible thread of discipline, consistency, and mental strength that had woven its way through every aspect of his life. Those unseen forces were the ones that had truly transformed him, quietly, steadily, and powerfully. Jake closed his eyes and thought about the future. He knew there would be new challenges ahead. There would be more obstacles, more moments of doubt, and more temptations to stray from his path. But as he had learned on his journey, it wasn't the big moments that defined him. It was the small, unseen moments, the ones no one else saw, that made all the difference. And as long as he continued to embrace those forces, Jake knew there was nothing he couldn't accomplish. Jake's life had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. What started as a journey to improve his physical fitness had transformed into a deep, personal evolution. He had learned that success wasn't just about strength or endurance, it was about commitment, mindset, and making the conscious choice to keep going, even when the road seemed unclear. Now, as he walked through the park on a Saturday morning, feeling the cool breeze against his skin, Jake was beginning to reflect on another aspect of his journey. There was something that had been gnawing at him recently, something more than physical transformation. It was the path he had taken, the one less traveled, the one that led him to discover who he truly was. As he looked around the park, people jogged along the paved path, some in groups, others running solo. He noticed how everyone seemed to be moving toward a clear destination. The well-worn path was easy, predictable. But Jake couldn't help but wonder, had he been taking the right road all along? Jake had always been the kind of person who preferred a structured routine. He loved the predictability of following a plan, whether it was for his workouts, his meals, or his daily schedule. But lately, he had been questioning whether the path he'd been following had truly been the best one for him. He remembered a conversation he had had with his sister, Sarah, a few weeks ago. She had asked him about his progress and how he was feeling about his life. At the time, Jake had been so focused on the physical aspects of his transformation that he hadn't really thought about the bigger picture. "Are you happy?" Sarah had asked him, her eyes searching his face. Jake had paused. The question caught him off guard. Of course, he was happy, he was healthier than ever, more confident, and his career was going well. But Sarah wasn't asking about his physical state. She was asking about his heart, his soul. "I think I am," Jake had replied. "But sometimes, I wonder if I'm just following a road because it's the one I'm used to. It feels safe, but I don't know if it's the right road for me anymore. Sarah had smiled softly. Sometimes the road that feels the safest isn't the one that leads to the most fulfillment. You've got to take a chance on the road less traveled. It might be scary, but it could be where you truly find yourself. As Jake walked through the park, he thought about her words. Could it be true? Could the road he had been following, the predictable, safe one, be holding him back? Jake wasn't sure. He had worked so hard to build his life around stability. But now, the thought of venturing into uncharted territory, of embracing uncertainty, began to stir something deep within him. What if he could take a different path? What if he could combine the lessons he had learned in his physical journey with a broader exploration of life? The road less traveled, the one full of uncertainty and unknowns, might just be the road to something greater than he had ever imagined. Later that evening, as Jake sat at his kitchen table, he reflected on how far he had come. He had never been the type to take risks. He had played it safe, done what was expected. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his journey wasn't just about physical strength. It was about embracing life's unpredictability. It was about stepping out of his comfort zone and trusting himself to handle whatever came his way. For so long, Jake had sought control. He wanted to make sure every workout was perfect, every meal was planned, every moment was structured. But what if the real growth lay in learning how to embrace the unknown? What if the true test of his transformation wasn't just about how much weight he could lift or how fast he could run, but how well he could adapt to the unexpected? The next day, Jake decided to take a chance. He called Mark, who was always up for an adventure, and suggested they do something different. "Hey, Mark. What do you think about going for a hike instead of our usual ride this weekend? Maybe head out to the trails a bit further from the city. Something new, a bit off the beaten path." There was a pause on the other end, and then Mark's voice came through, filled with enthusiasm. "That sounds like exactly what we need. I'm in." Saturday morning arrived, and Jake found himself loading up the car with Mark for the hike they had planned. They drove for about an hour, heading away from the familiar streets and into more rugged terrain. As they reached the trailhead, Jake felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty. This wasn't the usual predictable path. The trail was steeper, the landscape wilder. There were no clear markers, and the weather could change at any moment. But that's what made it exhilarating. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was stepping into something unknown, something that wasn't controlled or predictable. He was leaving behind the structure and embracing the adventure that lay ahead. The hike was physically challenging, but it was also liberating. As Jake and Mark made their way up the trail, they encountered rocky inclines, dense woods, and breathtaking views that only appeared when they ventured off the well-trodden path. At times, the trail seemed to disappear entirely, forcing them to navigate on intuition and sheer determination. There was something exhilarating about not knowing exactly where the path would lead them, about pushing through the uncertainty and discovering something new around every bend. Jake realized that this hike wasn't just about getting to the top of the mountain, it was about letting go of the need for control. It was about trusting that the journey, with all its twists and turns, was just as important as the destination. When they reached the summit, the view was stunning, vast expanses of green forests, distant hills, and the soft, golden light of the afternoon sun. Jake stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "This," Jake said to Mark, "this is what it's all about. The journey itself. Not just the destination." Mark grinned. "Told you it'd be worth it." As they made their way back down the trail, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had ventured into the unknown, embraced the road less traveled, and had found something deeper than he expected. This wasn't just about physical strength. It was about embracing the uncertainties of life and trusting that, even when the path wasn't clear, he could handle it. He knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges ahead, new roads to travel, and new decisions to make. But now, Jake understood that the real adventure lay not in following the well-paved paths, but in stepping off the beaten track and embracing the unknown. The road less traveled, he realized, wasn't a road to fear. It was the road to growth, to discovery, and to the fullest life. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to keep things together. He had learned early in life that strength meant not showing weakness. It was the same mindset that had driven his fitness journey. He pushed himself through pain, silenced his doubts, and never let anyone see him falter. But lately, something had begun to shift. The hike had been an eye-opener, but it wasn't just the physical challenges that had left an impact on Jake. It was something deeper. Something unexpected. During the hike, as he trudged up the steep trail, he had found himself opening up to Mark in a way he never had before. They had stopped at a viewpoint to catch their breath, and Mark had, as usual, thrown out one of his casual, probing questions. "So, Jake, what's really going on with you lately? I know you've been feeling a bit different." Jake had paused, staring out at the sprawling horizon. The answer wasn't something he had expected to share, but for some reason, the words had spilled out anyway. "It's just, everything," Jake had said, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I've been pushing myself so hard, working out, trying to control everything around me. But I feel like I'm not really living, you know. I'm constantly chasing the next thing, and I'm not sure what for anymore." Mark had nodded in understanding. "You're not the first person to feel that way. But sometimes, the hardest thing is allowing yourself to feel that uncertainty. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, Jake, it's a strength. Only when you're willing to face those uncomfortable feelings can you truly grow." The conversation had lingered in Jake's mind long after the hike was over. Vulnerability. Mark had always been a straightforward, no-nonsense kind of guy, but hearing him talk about vulnerability as a strength had planted a seed in Jake's mind. For days after the hike, Jake found himself reflecting on his own reluctance to open up. He realized that while he had no problem showing up for the tough workouts or pushing through difficult physical challenges, he had been avoiding the emotional ones. He had never allowed himself to be truly vulnerable. He had kept his feelings locked inside, buried beneath layers of self-reliance and pride. But the more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that vulnerability didn't have to mean weakness. It could mean honesty. It could mean growth. It could mean finally allowing himself to be open to others, not just in his relationships, but with himself. That evening, Jake sat alone in his apartment, his mind swirling. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, his fitness routine, his career, his life. But now, the idea of vulnerability kept echoing in his thoughts. Was it possible that the thing holding him back from true emotional freedom was his own refusal to be vulnerable? He grabbed his phone and scrolled through a few social media posts. Everyone seemed to be sharing snippets of their best lives, their workouts, their meals, their celebrations. But no one was showing the struggle. No one was talking about the tough days, the failures, the moments when they felt like giving up. Jake took a deep breath. Maybe it was time for him to change that. Maybe it was time to share his own story, his struggles, his fears, the parts of his journey that weren't perfect. He had always been afraid of letting people see that side of him, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that those parts of his story might help others feel less alone. The next day, Jake recorded a video on his phone. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew it was important. He wanted to be real. He wanted to be honest. "Hey, guys," Jake began, looking into the camera. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and I just wanted to share something with you. I've spent a lot of my life pushing through, trying to keep it all together. And, yeah, I've had some big wins in my fitness journey, but there's a side of me that I've been hiding. I've been afraid to show that side of me. The side that's not always strong. The side that doubts itself sometimes, that feels insecure, and that wants to give up." He paused, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't easy. But it felt real. I think it's time I stopped pretending like everything's perfect. Life isn't perfect. We all have our struggles, and that's okay. Being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. And if I'm going to continue growing, if I'm going to keep pushing forward, I have to be honest with myself. And with you. Jake ended the video, his heart racing. He wasn't sure how the video would be received. It felt strange to expose so much of himself, but there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had let go of something heavy. He felt lighter. More authentic. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, his video had gained hundreds of comments, messages, and likes. People thanked him for his honesty, for showing them that they weren't alone in their struggles. Jake had always been surprised by the support he received online, but this time, the messages felt different. They felt more personal, more real. For the first time, Jake realized that his vulnerability had connected him to others in a way his strength and achievements never could. He had shown the world his flaws, his insecurities, and his doubts, and in doing so, he had built a bridge of understanding with others who felt the same way. The next week, Jake met with Mark again, and this time, he couldn't help but share how the video had impacted him. "You were right, Mark," Jake said as they sat down for coffee. "Being vulnerable, it's not a weakness. It's a strength. I never realized how much I was holding back until I let myself be honest with others. It's like something inside me has shifted." Mark smiled, looking proud. "That's because real strength comes from within. When you stop hiding from yourself and others, you open up new possibilities. Vulnerability creates connection. And that's where the magic happens." Jake nodded, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. Vulnerability wasn't about exposing weakness. It was about showing up as your authentic self, flaws and all. And in doing so, you invited others to do the same. That night, as Jake reflected on his journey, he realized that he had come full circle. He had started out on this path of self-improvement thinking it was all about physical strength and discipline. But now, he understood that true strength came from being emotionally open and honest with himself and the world around him. His vulnerabilities weren't weaknesses, they were his greatest source of power. Jake had learned many things throughout his journey: how to push through physical pain, how to challenge his limits, and how to embrace vulnerability. But there was still one thing he hadn't fully come to terms with: trust. Trust in himself. Trust in others. And most importantly, trust in the process of growth. In the wake of the emotional revelations he had shared in his video, Jake found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth: he had spent so much of his life building walls around himself that he hadn't let anyone truly in. He had built an armor to protect himself from pain, from rejection, from disappointment. And while that armor had kept him safe, it had also kept him isolated. As he walked into the gym on a Monday morning, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. His workouts had been going well. His body felt strong, and his mind was clearer than it had been in months. But something was still missing. There was a distance he couldn't bridge, even with his closest friends. He had given a lot of himself to his followers and had opened up emotionally, but he hadn't yet rebuilt the trust with those closest to him. Mark had been by his side through so many of these challenges, but Jake realized there were still unspoken tensions between them. He hadn't always been the best friend. He had been self-absorbed, too focused on his own growth to really invest in the relationships that mattered. And now, after all of his personal growth, he was faced with the difficult task of rebuilding trust with those who mattered most. After his workout, Jake decided it was time for a heart-to-heart with Mark. They hadn't had a serious conversation in a while. It wasn't that they had drifted apart, far from it. But Jake knew that he needed to address the distance he had been feeling. He needed to make things right. They met at their usual diner later that evening. As they sat down across from each other, Jake felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't easy to admit that he had fallen short as a friend, but he knew it was necessary. "Mark," Jake started, his voice steady but soft, "I've been thinking a lot about everything lately. About how I've been, about how I've been acting. I haven't always been the best friend to you. I've been so wrapped up in my own stuff, I didn't stop to really think about you and the people who've always had my back." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was always worth listening. "I didn't realize how much I've pulled away, even when you were there for me," Jake continued. "I've been so focused on myself, on my progress, my journey, everything, that I forgot what matters most. People matter. You matter." Mark gave him a long, thoughtful look. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but direct. "You've been distant. And I get it. You've been through a lot, and you've had to make changes. But don't forget that you don't have to do everything alone." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was facing his friend as an equal, not as someone trying to prove something. The words were difficult to say, but in that moment, Jake felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't just about becoming stronger physically. Maybe it was about becoming stronger in his relationships. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he thought about what had just happened. Rebuilding trust was never easy. It required vulnerability, humility, and the willingness to admit mistakes. But he realized that the most important thing wasn't perfection. It was consistency. Trust didn't come from grand gestures, it came from showing up every day, being honest, and being present. Jake had made a commitment to change, to be more vulnerable, to embrace his flaws, and to rebuild the connections that truly mattered. But this was a long road, one that would take time and effort. And Jake knew that the real test would be how he continued to show up, not just in his workouts or his career, but in his friendships and his relationships. The next few weeks were a time of reflection and small steps forward. Jake worked on being more present, not just for himself, but for the people around him. He made an effort to check in with Mark and the others in his life, to show up without the expectation of anything in return. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, he still found himself slipping back into old habits of isolation and self-focus. But each time he did, he made an effort to recognize it, to apologize, and to refocus. He spent more time with his family, something he hadn't done as much before. They weren't perfect, no family was, but there was love there, and that love was worth nurturing. He had been so focused on his personal transformation that he had forgotten how important those relationships were. Now, he was doing his best to rebuild those bonds. One evening, about a month after his heart-to-heart with Mark, Jake found himself sitting at the kitchen table with his parents. They were having a quiet dinner, talking about their day. His mom was asking about his latest workout routine, and his dad was telling a funny story about something that had happened at work. For the first time in a long time, Jake realized he felt at peace. He didn't need to constantly prove himself. He didn't need to chase after success or recognition. What mattered most were the people who loved him, and he was finally starting to appreciate that. The next morning, Jake received a text from Mark. It was simple but meaningful: "Let's grab coffee later this week. We'll talk about that next big goal of yours, together." Jake smiled at the message, feeling a sense of warmth wash over him. The road to rebuilding trust wasn't always clear or easy. It required humility, vulnerability, and the willingness to make amends. But in that moment, Jake understood that it was the most important part of the journey. Without trust, without connection, all the physical strength in the world didn't matter. As Jake stood in the gym the next day, he thought about how far he had come. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had learned that strength didn't come from avoiding vulnerability or trying to do everything on his own. True strength came from being willing to open up, to trust others, and to admit when you needed help. And as he picked up the weights for his next set, Jake knew that he was ready for whatever came next. Because this time, he wasn't walking alone. Jake had always prided himself on his dedication to fitness. He woke up early, worked hard at the gym, and pushed himself to the limit with every set, every rep, and every mile. In his mind, strength came from hard work, constant, relentless effort. Rest was for the weak, or so he thought. But something had been shifting in him for the past few weeks. The physical improvements were still there, but something else was missing. His energy felt depleted. His muscles, although strong, were beginning to feel worn out. And the mental clarity he had once prided himself on was starting to fade. Jake had been reading a lot about the importance of recovery and fitness, about how rest wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The problem was, it went against everything he had ever believed. How could rest be as important as the grind? How could taking it easy be just as crucial as pushing harder? One evening, after a particularly tough leg day, Jake felt more exhausted than usual. His muscles were sore, and his mind was heavy with thoughts of his next workout. He glanced in the mirror and saw the weariness in his eyes. He could still push himself harder, couldn't he? But then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. "You've been hitting it hard lately, man. How are you feeling? I know you're on a roll, but don't forget about recovery. Your body needs time to repair, and you'll see better results if you give yourself a break." Jake sighed. Mark was right, as usual. He had been so focused on his next goal, his next challenge, that he hadn't even realized how much his body was begging for rest. But taking time off felt like losing ground, like stepping backward. How could he afford that? The next morning, Jake decided to take Mark's advice seriously. He wasn't going to push himself through another grueling workout. Instead, he decided to spend the day resting, physically, mentally, and emotionally. He started with a light stretch, focusing on each muscle, appreciating the effort his body had been putting in over the past several weeks. For the first time in a while, Jake really tuned into his body, listening to the subtle cues of fatigue. His muscles weren't broken, just tired. They needed time to recover, to rebuild stronger than before. After his stretch, he made himself a healthy breakfast and spent the morning reading. His mind, which had been clouded by endless to-do lists and workout goals, began to clear. He allowed himself to enjoy the silence, the stillness, and the sense of peace that came from simply being present. Later that afternoon, Jake went for a walk in the park. It wasn't a strenuous walk, just a casual stroll. He noticed things he hadn't before, how the sun warmed his face, how the breeze moved through the trees, how calm everything felt. He couldn't remember the last time he had allowed himself to just be, without the pressure to always be doing, achieving, or striving. As he walked, he thought about all the times he had dismissed rest. He had always seen it as an obstacle, something that slowed down his progress. But now, he understood that it wasn't the absence of effort, it was part of the process. Rest wasn't a break from success, it was a necessary part of achieving long-term goals. That evening, as Jake sat down to dinner, he felt a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, his muscles weren't screaming at him for attention. His mind wasn't consumed with thoughts of the next workout. He felt present in the moment, connected to his body in a way he hadn't before. As he reflected on the day, Jake realized that the constant grind wasn't sustainable. He had learned that pushing harder didn't always mean achieving more. Sometimes, the key to success was knowing when to step back, to rest, and to allow your body and mind to recover. He thought about his goals, his fitness goals, his personal growth goals, his career ambitions. It wasn't enough to just work harder. He needed balance. He needed to respect the natural rhythms of his body and mind. After all, real strength wasn't just about the work you put in, it was about understanding the value of rest and recovery. The next few days, Jake made a conscious effort to incorporate rest into his routine. He still worked hard, but he balanced it with periods of active recovery, gentle stretching, yoga, walking. He started getting more sleep, prioritizing his body's need for rest over his desire to push harder. He noticed a significant difference. Not only did he feel stronger physically, but he felt clearer mentally. He had more energy, more focus, and more clarity than he had in months. It was as if his body had been waiting for permission to heal, to recover, and now that he had given it that permission, it was responding with renewed strength. A week later, Jake met with Mark for their usual catch-up over coffee. As they sat down, Mark gave him a curious look. "You've been looking better lately," Mark said. "How's everything going?" Jake smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "You were right, man. I've been taking more time for rest, and it's made a huge difference. I feel better than I have in a long time, stronger, more focused, more balanced. It's crazy how much I've been missing by constantly pushing myself." Mark nodded, looking pleased. "I'm glad to hear that. Rest isn't a luxury, it's part of the journey. We often forget that the body needs time to adapt, to rebuild. And when we respect that, it pays off in the long run." Jake sat back in his chair, reflecting on the past few weeks. His journey wasn't just about physical strength anymore. It was about listening to his body, respecting his limits, and understanding that true progress came from a combination of effort and recovery. The grind was important, but so was the rest. Later that day, as Jake finished his workout, he paused for a moment before stepping off the treadmill. He felt stronger, both physically and mentally. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that the key to becoming his best self wasn't just about how hard he could push, it was about how well he could balance effort with rest. Jake stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His muscles had grown, his strength had increased, and his endurance was better than ever. Yet, as he flexed his arms, something felt off. He had been pushing for a specific goal, one that had seemed just within reach for months. But the last few weeks had taught him something new: progress wasn't always linear. He had always been a man of action, a man who believed that if he worked hard enough, results would come. But lately, it seemed like every time he hit one milestone, another obstacle appeared in its place. He'd reach a new personal best on his bench press, only to have an unexpected setback that took him a few steps back. His body was stronger than it had been in years, but the journey felt longer than he had expected. Patience, it seemed, was something he still struggled to master. It wasn't just in the gym. His personal life had become a mirror of his physical journey. Relationships had become strained as he worked longer hours, focusing on his goals. The time he once spent with family and friends had slowly slipped away, replaced by constant self-improvement and hustle. Jake had built a life based on results, but he was beginning to realize that some things, like genuine connections with others and true emotional fulfillment, couldn't be rushed. The realization hit him hardest during a conversation with his mom, one that had been long overdue. "You've been pushing yourself so hard lately," his mom said, her voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Jake had nodded, the words, "I'm fine," spilling out as if on autopilot. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't fine. Not completely. He had been working tirelessly toward his goals, but something had been slipping through his fingers. Time. Relationships. Balance. He had been moving forward at full speed, but he hadn't taken the time to check if what he was building was truly what he wanted. The following morning, Jake decided to take a step back. He wasn't going to push himself to hit new records today. Instead, he was going to take a more patient, mindful approach to his day. His goal wasn't just to lift more weight or run faster, it was to understand the value of patience in the process of becoming his best self. He started his day with a slow breakfast, savoring each bite. He had been so caught up in the rush of life that he hadn't realized how much he had missed the simple moments, the act of taking time to enjoy the food in front of him, the sound of the coffee brewing, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window. He spent the rest of the day with his family, enjoying a quiet Saturday afternoon. They played board games, laughed at old jokes, and shared stories. It wasn't filled with monumental moments or grand achievements, but in that space, Jake felt something he hadn't in a long time: contentment. There was no rush, no race against the clock. Just time spent with people who cared about him, with no expectations other than to simply be present. The following week, Jake started applying this new mindset to his workouts as well. Instead of obsessing over personal records or pushing himself beyond his limits, he focused on consistency. He listened to his body more closely. He focused on his form, on making incremental progress rather than expecting instant results. Every lift, every stretch, every breath was deliberate. It wasn't about the destination anymore, it was about the process. He found that his workouts felt more enjoyable, less like a chore and more like a journey. He wasn't just working out for the sake of improving his physique, he was working out to nurture his body, to take care of it, to grow stronger at his own pace. A few weeks into this new mindset, Jake's physical strength continued to improve, but in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't obsessed with the numbers anymore. He wasn't trying to outdo himself every single day. Instead, he was enjoying the steady progress, the small victories. His body was responding to this slower, more patient approach. He also noticed a shift in his mindset. He began to embrace the fact that not everything in life could be hurried. Whether it was rebuilding relationships, growing his career, or simply finding peace of mind, some things took time. And that was okay. One evening, after a particularly calming workout, Jake sat on the bench, wiping the sweat from his brow. His thoughts drifted back to the conversations he had been having with Mark over the past few months. They had often talked about the importance of progress, of setting goals and achieving them. But now, Jake saw something in their talks that he hadn't noticed before. Mark had always emphasized patience, the ability to stay steady even when things felt slow. "I think I get it now," Jake said aloud, almost to himself. Patience is the key. As he sat there, reflecting on everything he had learned, Jake realized that this was a part of his growth. It wasn't about always being on the move, always trying to achieve more. It was about trusting the process and knowing that everything had its time. A few days later, Mark texted him, as he often did after a workout. This time, Jake had something different to say. "I think I've finally learned the lesson you've been trying to teach me," Jake wrote. Patience. It's not just about the grind, it's about embracing the pace and letting things unfold naturally. Mark's response was simple, but it hit Jake in a meaningful way. "Took you long enough, man. But I'm proud of you." Jake smiled at the message. It wasn't about the pride anymore, it wasn't about the achievement of hitting goals or proving himself. It was about the patience to accept where he was, to know that every step, no matter how small, was still a step forward. As the weeks passed, Jake felt more at peace. His workouts were still challenging, but they felt purposeful. He was no longer chasing the unattainable ideal of constant perfection. Instead, he was learning to appreciate the journey. The ups, the downs, and everything in between. His relationships were slowly mending, too. By being more present, more patient, and more willing to listen, Jake had found that his connections with others were growing deeper. Sitting down for dinner with his family one evening, Jake felt a sense of gratitude. This wasn't the life of constant hustle he had once imagined for himself, but it was exactly what he needed. In that moment, he realized that patience wasn't a limitation, it was freedom. Freedom from the pressure to constantly achieve, freedom from the belief that every moment needed to be filled with action. It was okay to slow down. It was okay to wait for the right moment. And in that space, Jake found a strength that wasn't defined by how much he could lift or how fast he could run, but by how patiently he could trust the process of his own life. Jake sat at his desk, the quiet hum of the office filling the air. His computer screen glowed softly, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been weeks since he made the conscious decision to slow down, to embrace patience, and to focus on steady, consistent growth instead of chasing the elusive idea of perfection. Yet, something still nagged at him. He had learned so much about recovery, rest, and patience, but now he faced a new challenge, letting go of his perfectionist tendencies once and for all. It was late in the afternoon when the thought hit him again. What if I'm still not good enough? What if I'm still not doing enough? The familiar inner voice crept in, pushing him toward more, toward better, toward a standard that always felt just out of reach. Jake leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He had worked so hard for so long to be the best version of himself. He had fought through injuries, setbacks, doubts, and fears. His body was stronger, more capable than ever before. But now, with all this newfound knowledge and growth, he was faced with a more personal battle, accepting that progress, not perfection, was the goal. The next morning, Jake decided to take a walk outside to clear his head. He was still wrestling with the concept of progress versus perfection, but he needed to gain some perspective. The cool breeze and the sunlight on his face helped him relax, but his thoughts remained clouded. As he walked through the park, he saw families playing, people running, and children laughing. It was a simple scene, yet it held so much meaning for him. Everyone there was living in the moment, not worried about being perfect, but simply enjoying the journey of life as it unfolded before them. He found a bench and sat down, letting himself feel the peace of the present moment. There were no deadlines here, no expectations. It wasn't about how much better someone was compared to anyone else, it was about being content with where you are. The next few days passed in a haze of thoughts and reflection. Jake didn't push himself too hard, but he also didn't back off entirely. He was still dedicated to his fitness, but this time, his workouts were different. He was no longer looking for the perfect body or the fastest time. Instead, he was looking for a connection to his body, to the effort he put in, and to the way each movement made him feel. As he lifted weights, he focused on his form, on the strength in his arms, the way his muscles worked in unison. He didn't care that he wasn't hitting a new personal best. Instead, he marveled at how his body had grown over the past months, how far he had come. It was a moment of gratitude, not competition. And then, one morning, something remarkable happened. Jake was out for his morning run, his feet hitting the pavement with steady rhythm. The familiar path around the park felt different that day. There was no timer, no goal. He wasn't chasing an ideal. He was simply running for the sake of running. And that felt liberating. As he approached the final stretch of his route, he noticed a young man ahead of him. The guy was running faster, pushing himself harder, clearly focused on a goal. Jake instinctively tried to speed up, a rush of competitive energy filling him. But just before he did, he paused. This wasn't about him. Jake let the other runner go ahead, choosing instead to maintain his own pace. As the young man pulled farther ahead, Jake slowed, allowing himself to finish at his own steady pace. It wasn't about racing him. It wasn't about competing at all. It was about enjoying the journey, the process, and appreciating where he was in that moment. Jake crossed the finish line, his finish line, and smiled to himself. He had won. But it wasn't a race against anyone else. It was a race with himself. The following weekend, Jake caught up with Mark for their usual Saturday coffee. They sat outside, the warm sun casting long shadows across the table. Mark was the first to speak. "I can tell you've been in a different headspace lately," he said, studying Jake with a knowing look. "How's the balance going? Are you finally feeling at peace with the process?" Jake smiled and nodded. "I think I'm starting to get it. I used to think that perfection was the goal, that if I just pushed hard enough, I'd eventually get there. But now, I see that it's not about perfection at all. It's about progress. And that's what I'm learning to embrace." Mark leaned back in his chair. "It's the journey, not the destination, right?" "Exactly," Jake replied. "I don't need to be perfect. I just need to keep moving forward. And that's enough." As the weeks passed, Jake's perspective continued to shift. His workouts were still a priority, but they no longer consumed him. He still sought improvement, but not at the expense of his happiness or well-being. He had learned to celebrate the small victories, the extra rep, the extra minute, the small steps forward. And more importantly, he had learned to let go of the need to be perfect. He found joy in the process, in the act of getting better, not in an unattainable ideal. Perfection, he realized, was a myth, a trap that kept him from enjoying the beauty of progress itself. One night, as he was winding down from a long day, Jake sat on the couch, reflecting on everything he had learned. His fitness journey, once a quest for perfection, had evolved into something deeper. It was no longer just about lifting heavier weights or running faster times, it was about learning to appreciate the strength that had always been within him. It was about finding peace with where he was in the present, knowing that progress was a slow, steady climb. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments when he felt stuck, but those were just part of the journey. They didn't define him. What defined him was his ability to keep going, to keep progressing, and to keep embracing the process, flaws and all. Jake smiled as he closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Not because he was perfect, but because he had finally learned that imperfection was the key to growth. Jake stood at the edge of the park, looking out over the vast expanse of green. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon, and for a moment, everything felt right. The world felt still, yet full of possibility. It was a moment of reflection, a moment where everything that had brought him here seemed to come full circle. It had been a year since that pivotal turning point in his life, the day he chose to embrace patience and reject the never-ending pursuit of perfection. That day had changed him in ways he couldn't have imagined at the time. And now, standing here, he understood something even deeper. The lesson wasn't just about slowing down or learning to appreciate the journey, it was about being okay with who you are in this moment. Jake had grown in more ways than one, physically, mentally, and emotionally. His body had become stronger, yes, but it wasn't just his muscles that had grown. His mind had learned the value of rest, recovery, and progress. His relationships had deepened because he had learned to invest time in others, not just in himself. His heart had found peace in the small victories, in the quiet moments that once seemed insignificant. As he took a deep breath, the cool evening air filled his lungs. He had reached a place of balance. He wasn't chasing some abstract ideal anymore. He was living his life, focusing on consistency and growth, without the constant pressure to be perfect. His life had become about the process, and that was something worth celebrating. Jake's thoughts drifted to the people who had supported him along the way. Mark, the ever-optimistic friend, had been there every step of the journey. His unwavering belief in Jake's potential had often been the anchor when the doubts crept in. And then there was his family, especially his mom, who had been the voice of reason in his life. She had always told him that he was enough, that he didn't have to be perfect to be loved or successful. Jake's transformation wasn't just physical, it was holistic. It was the realization that success didn't come from how much you could achieve, but from how well you could appreciate the process and the people around you. It was about finding peace in the present moment and not always rushing ahead to the next thing. A few days later, Jake had a conversation with his mom that stood out above the rest. They were sitting in her living room, having their usual Saturday afternoon chat. She poured them both a cup of tea, and as they sat together, Jake realized just how much he appreciated these simple moments. "I've noticed something," his mom said softly, her eyes twinkling. "You're different now. You've always been determined, but now, you've learned to be kind to yourself. To trust your own journey. I'm so proud of you." Jake smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Thanks, Mom. I've learned a lot this year. I thought I had to always be working, always striving for more. But now I see that the best growth comes when I'm not constantly chasing something. It's about being in the moment." His mom nodded, her smile wide. "Exactly. You've got the balance now, Jake. And that's what matters most." Weeks passed, and Jake's life continued to flow with a newfound rhythm. He was still working on his fitness, but he wasn't obsessed with hitting personal records anymore. He wasn't focused on competing with others or trying to measure up to unrealistic standards. Instead, he enjoyed the act of being present in every rep, every step, and every meal. His workouts were not a means to an end but an opportunity to nurture and appreciate the strength he had built over time. One evening, while reflecting on everything he had learned, Jake realized how far he had come. There was a time when he would have measured his success by how much weight he could lift or how fast he could run. But now, his success wasn't measured by numbers, it was measured by the way he felt. By how content he was with himself, by how much peace he found in the present moment. At a dinner with friends, Jake shared his journey. It wasn't a boastful story, but one of personal growth, vulnerability, and gratitude. He talked about the importance of finding balance, of embracing imperfection, and of focusing on steady progress. His friends listened intently, nodding along with understanding. They could see the change in him, how much more grounded and at peace he had become. I used to think it was all about pushing myself to the absolute limit, Jake said, looking around the table. But now I know that it's not about perfection. It's about being patient with yourself and trusting that progress comes over time. Mark, sitting across from him, raised his glass. Here's to that, my friend. To progress, not perfection. Everyone cheered, and Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey he had taken was more than just physical, it had been a journey of the soul. And he was proud of every single step. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?